Sir, we don't know where else to go. Every shop in this whole county is closed. We've got a man who can barely stand up. We've got bikes that won't run, and we're out of options. Can you help us? Marcus Holloway stared at the man standing in his doorway, soaking wet leather vest, dark with rain, helmet tucked under one arm, and felt something shift deep inside his chest. He had been holding an eviction notice in his left hand when the knock came. 17 strangers, a storm that wasn't stopping, and a door he hadn't yet decided to close. If you've ever been helped by a stranger when the whole world said no, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The eviction notice was dated the 14th. Marcus Holloway read it 3 times, standing at his workbench in the back of the garage, because part of him kept hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less final. They didn't. The landlord's letterhead was crisp and professional, the language clean and cold, the kind of legal prose that reduced 38 years of a man's life to a single phrase: failure to remit payment. He folded the paper along its original crease and tucked it back into the bottom of his toolbox. Underneath a wrench he'd been using since 1987, and he stood there for a long moment with his hand resting on the lid. Outside, the rain had turned serious. It had started as a drizzle sometime around 4 in the afternoon, the kind of weather that felt more like atmosphere than storm. A gray Tennessee sky pushing moisture down in soft sheets that you could still drive through without much trouble. But somewhere around 7, it changed character entirely. The drizzle became a downpour, then the downpour became something with intention behind it. Rain moving sideways off the hills east of Redwood Creek, carrying with it the kind of cold that settled into your joints and stayed there. Lightning had been walking across the ridge for the past 20 minutes, and the thunder that followed each strike was the deep chest-pressing kind that you didn't so much hear as feel. Marcus had worked through worse weather. He'd worked through ice storms and floods and one memorable February blizzard that had dropped 18 inches on Redwood Creek in a single night. And through all of it, the garage had held the old corrugated metal roof singing against the wind, but never giving up entirely. Tonight, he wasn't thinking about the roof. He was thinking about the folded piece of paper in his toolbox, and about the phone call he hadn't returned from his landlord, and about the fact that he had $47 in his checking account and a coffee can on the workbench that held another $63 in cash, and none of that added up to anything close to what he owed. He pulled the chain on the hanging work light above the bench. The fluorescent tube buzzed and flickered and then steadied itself, washing the garage in that particular flat white light that made everything look both very clear and very tired at the same time. Marcus looked at his hands in that light, 67 years old, knuckles that had been broken and reset, skin that had taken on the permanent gray-brown stain of a man who had spent his adult life with engine grease worked into every crease and pore. He flexed his fingers, slowly feeling the familiar ache in the middle joints, and thought about how those same hands had once been considered among the most skilled in the business. People used to drive 4 hours to have Marcus Holloway look at a motorcycle that nobody else could figure out. That was a long time ago. He reached up and clicked off the work light. He was going to do it. He was going to lock the front bay door, drive the 12 minutes back to his house on Crestview, and in the morning he was going to call the landlord and have the conversation he'd been postponing for 3 weeks. It was time. He knew it the same way he'd known when his wife Evelyn was dying, that particular internal knowledge that comes before you're ready to admit it out loud, a certainty that lives in the stomach before it ever reaches the mind. He picked up his jacket from the hook by the back door. He heard the engines. He stopped. Not one engine, not 2. Something else entirely, a multiple overlapping sound that he recognized before he could have explained how the way a person who grew up around a certain kind of music can identify a key change in the first 3 notes. That was the particular chord of a group of large displacement motorcycles moving together, engines running rough, at least a few of them not cycling clean. He stood with his jacket half on and listened. And the soundbar grew louder and then changed pitch as whatever was making it turned off the main road and came up the gravel approach to his garage. Marcus shrugged his jacket the rest of the way on and walked to the front of the garage and looked through the small wire glass window beside the bay door. Headlights, a lot of them moving through the rain in a loose formation, the beams catching the water and turning it white and silver. He counted without meaning to 1, 2, 5, 8, 12. They kept coming until there were 17 motorcycles pulled up in a rough semicircle in his muddy gravel lot engines, running rain hammering down on 17 riders who were absolutely soaking wet and looked from what Marcus could see through the streaky glass like they had come a very long way in very bad conditions. He stood at the window for a moment. He had every reason to walk out the back door. He was closed. He was broke. He was in the process of losing this building and everything inside it. He had no obligation to anyone who pulled into his lot at 8:30 on a Thursday night during a rainstorm that the county weather service had upgraded twice in the past hour. He had his jacket on. He had his keys in his hand. He had $47.63 between himself and whatever came next, and none of that would be improved by opening the bay door. He opened the bay door. The rain came in immediately, a cold diagonal rush of it, and the noise of it changed from a percussion on the roof to something more present and personal. The nearest rider cut his engine, then the next one. One by one, the engines went quiet until the only sounds were the rain and the idling of two bikes in the back of the group that apparently hadn't gotten the memo yet. The man at the front climbed off his motorcycle slowly, the way a person does when their legs have been in the same position for too long and their body is registering its objections. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his mid-50s, with a graying beard that the rain had plastered flat against his face. He pulled off his helmet and held it at his side and walked toward Marcus through the rain without hurrying, which Marcus noticed and filed away. "Sir," the man's voice was hoarse, "we don't know where else to go. Every shop in this whole county is closed. We've got a man who can barely stand up. We've got bikes that won't run, and we're out of options. Can you help us?" Marcus looked past him at the group still sitting on their bikes. He could see even from the doorway that several riders were hunched forward in ways that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with pain or cold or both. Near the back of the group, two men were helping a third off a motorcycle, and the third man's movements were careful in the way that a person is careful when something hurts badly enough that the wrong motion might make them lose their footing. "How many of you are hurt?" Marcus asked. The tall man glanced back over his shoulder. "3 definite, 2 more that won't admit it." "How many bikes can't run?" 4 can't move under their own power. 3 more that are running rough enough I wouldn't trust them on wet road. Marcus looked at the man for another moment. He looked at the eviction notice that he knew was sitting folded inside his toolbox. He looked at the rain coming down in the lot behind the tall man, and at 17 human beings who had nowhere else to be. "Bring them inside," Marcus said. "Nobody's staying out in this." He stepped back from the doorway and raised his voice to carry over the rain. "Pull the bikes as far in as you can get them. Hurt people first through the side door. There's a space heater in the back. Bring the ones that can't ride in on their side stands. We'll push them." The tall man stood in the rain and stared at him for a beat too long. "Move," Marcus said. "You're letting the warmth out." The man's name was Riley Carter. He said it while shaking Marcus's hand inside the bay, and Marcus filed it alongside everything else he was filing: the condition of the riders, the condition of the bikes, the inventory of what he had and didn't have, the mental arithmetic of how bad this was about to get versus how much he could actually do about it. "Marcus Holloway," he said, "this is my shop." "We saw the sign was dark," Riley said. "We almost kept going. Sign's been dark for 3 months. I can't afford the electricity for it." Marcus said it without apology or embarrassment, because at 67 he had run out of energy for shame about things that weren't his fault. "How long you been in the rain?" "About 4 hours since the storm caught us proper. We were pushing for Cookville, but we had our first breakdown about 40 miles back, and it slowed everything down, and then the second one, and by the time we figured out the road situation..." Riley stopped and shook his head. "We should have stopped earlier." "Where'd you come from today?" "Knoxville originally, but we detoured through the valley for it doesn't matter. It was a longer day than we planned." Marcus had been looking at Riley's hands while he talked. The knuckles were split on the right hand, not from a fight, the pattern was wrong for a fight, but from the particular way a person's hands respond when they've been gripping wet handlebars in cold wind for 4 hours. The skin cracks at the joints first. Marcus had seen it on his own hands 30 years ago before he'd learned to manage it. "Get your people in here and sit them down," Marcus said. "I'll get the heater going to proper, and then I want to look at anyone who's hurt before I look at any bike. You tell your folks that's how it's going to be." Riley looked at him for a moment with an expression Marcus couldn't immediately read. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, Marcus said. Go get your people. The three riders who were definitely hurt were named as Marcus learned. In the next 20 minutes, Deacon, a heavy-set man in his early 60s who had taken a low-speed slide on wet pavement 2 hours back and done something to his left shoulder that made him go pale and still when Marcus carefully moved it through its range. Tommy, who was 26 years old and looked younger, and who had a gash along his right forearm from a piece of road debris that had come up under his guard. And Walt, who was 68 years old, and who had, in this one Marcus took seriously, been showing signs of what looked like hypothermia for the past 40 minutes, according to the two men who'd been riding beside him. Walt was the one who'd been helped off his bike in the lot. Marcus brought Walt directly to the back office, which was the warmest part of the building, because the space heater had been running in there all day, and he sat him down in the only chair that wasn't covered in paperwork and looked at him carefully. Walt's skin had that particular grayish cast, his lips had a faint bluish quality at the edges, and when Marcus asked him to follow a finger with his eyes, the tracking was slow. How long has he been like this? Marcus asked the man who'd helped bring Walt in, a younger guy, maybe 35, broad across the chest, who introduced himself as Junior. Maybe an hour, he said. He was fine. They always say they're fine. Marcus was already moving, pulling the emergency blanket he kept on the shelf above the filing cabinet. Old habit from years of being the only help available for miles in any direction, and wrapping it around Walt's shoulders. There any dry clothes in any of your saddlebags? Some. Get them. Anything dry. Doesn't matter whose. Size doesn't matter right now. He made Walt drink hot water first, not coffee, because he'd learned a long time ago that caffeine was the wrong thing when a body was trying to regulate its core temperature. He sat with Walt while Junior went to organize dry clothing, and he talked to the old man in a steady, quiet voice. Nothing urgent, nothing alarming, just the kind of conversation you have with someone when what you actually need them to do is stay focused and stay present. You ride long? Marcus asked. Walt's answer came slowly. 40 years. Where from? Virginia originally, settled in Knoxville, 1982. You know the Blue Ridge well. Every mile of it. Something came into Walt's eyes, then a small animation, the particular light that comes on in people's faces when you find the right subject. Did the Skyline drive in? He stopped to remember in '79. On a Sportster that had no business being on mountain roads. But it made it. She always made it. Walt managed something close to a smile. Bikes like people. They rise to it when somebody asks them to. Marcus looked at the color returning slowly to the skin around Walt's mouth. Better. Not fine, not yet, but moving in the right direction. He'd want to watch him for another hour before he felt comfortable turning his attention fully elsewhere. I'm going to have someone sit with you, Marcus said. You don't stand up without telling them first. You understand me? Walt looked at him with the slightly unfocused dignity of a man who was used to being the one who gave instructions. I'm not a child. No, sir, you're not, Marcus said evenly. You're a 68-year-old man who's been in wet 40-degree wind for 4 hours, and your body is doing its best to catch up. I'm not asking you to be a child. I'm asking you to let the heat do its job without you interrupting it. Can you do that? A pause. I can do that, Walt said. So Tommy's arm was the next thing Marcus addressed. The gash was long, maybe 4 inches, running diagonally across the outer forearm, but not deep enough to need stitching by a professional, which was fortunate because Marcus's options in that department were limited to his first aid kit and whatever he could improvise. He cleaned it thoroughly, which made Tommy suck air through his teeth and grip the edge of the workbench with his other hand, and then butterfly bandaged the edges together and wrapped it firmly. You're going to want a doctor to look at this tomorrow, Marcus said. It's fine, Tommy said. It's fine right now because I cleaned it. Tomorrow morning, it might be a different story if you do not get it properly looked at. I'm telling you this as information, not as a suggestion. Tommy looked at his wrapped arm. He was young enough that this was probably the worst he'd been hurt. Marcus could tell by the slightly shaken quality around his eyes, the way he was working to maintain an expression of nonchalance that didn't quite reach. You've done this before, Tommy said. Many times, Marcus said. Hold still. Deacon's shoulder was the one Marcus was most concerned about because the range of motion loss combined with the specific location of the tenderness suggested something more than a bruise, and he didn't have the equipment or the expertise to rule out a partial tear. He immobilized it as best he could, made Deacon take 3 ibuprofen from the bottle in the first aid kit, and told him what he told Tommy Doctor tomorrow. Not tomorrow afternoon, tomorrow morning. Can you ride? Marcus asked him. I can ride one-handed if I have to. That's not what I asked. Deacon looked at him steadily. He was a big man, maybe 6'2", with the kind of face that had been through enough weather to have settled into something permanent and calm. I can ride, he said. I've ridden worse. Marcus held his gaze. I believe you, he said. I'm still going to have someone else on your left side the whole way wherever you're going. The two who wouldn't admit to being hurt were easier to identify than they seemed to think. One had a wrist he was favoring so consistently that it had to be at minimum a bad sprain. Marcus addressed it with an elastic wrap from the same first aid kit, and the other had a cut above his left eyebrow that had been bleeding slowly for long enough that his jacket collar was stained rust brown at the edge. That one Marcus cleaned and closed with 2 butterfly strips without making any remarks, because the man looked like making remarks would produce a longer and less productive conversation than simply doing the job. By the time Marcus finished with the riders, he'd been in the garage for 45 minutes without touching a single motorcycle. Nobody had complained about it. The coffee was the next thing. He had 1 bag left, a pound of ground dark roast that had been sitting on the shelf above the utility sink for 2 weeks, bought on the sale, rationed carefully. He'd been nursing it because coffee had started feeling like a luxury, and he'd been trying to recalibrate his sense of what was necessary. He filled the machine without a second thought and listened to it begin its cycle while he assessed the motorcycle situation. Riley walked up beside him while he stood looking at the bikes arranged in the bay. 7 of them need work, Marcus said. 4 that won't move at all, and 3 I wouldn't put on wet road. That's what I figured. The 4 that won't move, you know what the problem is on any of them, or you just know they stopped. Riley pulled a small notebook from his vest pocket. The notebook was wet at the edges, but he'd been keeping it in an interior pocket, and the pages were legible. He'd written down what each bike had done before it stopped and when. Marcus looked at the notes and thought that this was a man who paid attention, which was going to make the night easier. This one, Riley pointed to a Harley Electra Glide sitting closest to the door, cut out suddenly about 40 miles back. No warning, no coughing, just off, like someone threw a switch. Electrical, Marcus said. Most likely the ignition module or a connection failure somewhere in the system. Not uncommon on these in wet conditions. He moved to the next one. This one, progressive loss of power over about 20 minutes, then she started missing hard, then she died. Marcus bent down and looked at the fuel line. When did it last have a full service? Riley consulted his notebook. About 8 months ago for this rider, but he bought it secondhand and he's not sure what was done before that. Marcus straightened up. Fuel delivery problem. Could be the carb, could be the inline filter, could be a fuel pump starting to fail. I'll know more when I open it up. He moved down the line, looking, listening to Riley's descriptions, building the picture in his head. The 3rd bike had thrown a chain. The 4th had a clutch that had apparently been slipping for days and had finally given up entirely 20 miles out in the rain. Marcus stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and ran the math. He had his tools. He had his experience. He had 38 years of accumulated knowledge about what breaks on motorcycles and why, and what you do about it when the parts you need are sitting in a catalog instead of on your shelf. What he did not have was a fuel pump for a mid-2000s touring bike, or the specific ignition module that the Electra Glide almost certainly needed, or fresh clutch plates, or several other items that would have been on his standard stock list a decade ago when the business was running. What he had was everything else he'd ever learned. He turned to Riley. I need to know what's in your saddlebags and what your people are carrying. Tools, spare parts, anything. I'll tell you what I need and your folks can tell me what they have and we'll go from there. Riley looked at him with that same expression he'd had at the door, the one Marcus still couldn't entirely read. You think you can fix them? I think I can fix most of them, Marcus said. The rest I can make riddable enough to get somewhere real in the morning, but I need to know what I'm working with. He paused. And I need your people to stay out of my way while I work unless I ask for something specific. Can you manage that? I can manage that. Then let's get started. He started with the Electra Glide because electrical problems had a way of concealing themselves and then revealing something unexpected, and he wanted the full span of the night if it turned out to be worse than it looked. He pulled the seat and the side panels and began working through the ignition system methodically, not rushing, because rushing on electrical work was how you created problems that hadn't existed before you started. Three of the riders who weren't hurt and didn't have bikes needing work drifted over and watched him without being asked to. He didn't object to being watched. He'd never minded it. What he minded was being talked to while he was trying to think, and he said so directly pleasantly, and the three men nodded and watched in silence. The coffee machine beeped. One of the watching men, Marcus didn't have his name yet, went and poured a mug without being asked, and brought it to Marcus and set it on the workbench within reach without saying anything. Marcus glanced at him. The man nodded once and went back to his spot. Marcus found the problem in the ignition system 22 minutes in. Not the module itself. The module was fine. A connector corroded enough that it was making intermittent contact at best, had finally lost even that when the rain got into it, and the thermal cycling of the ride had expanded and contracted everything just enough to break the last reliable connection. In dry conditions on a warm day, it might have held for another year. In these conditions, it was never going to run again without intervention. He had the right gauge wire. He had the right terminals. He did not have a proper weatherproof connector seal, but he had electrical tape and he had a heat shrink kit and he had 40 years of making things work and with what was available. And 40 minutes later, the Electroglide started on the first try and sat idling at a smooth, steady rhythm while the three watching men made sounds of approval that they'd been holding in for a while. Good machine, Marcus said to no one in particular. Just needed someone to listen to it. He moved to the next one. Around 10:30, Riley appeared at his elbow again. "You need to eat something," Riley said. Marcus looked up from the carburetor he was rebuilding, which he'd pulled from the second dead bike, and had spread in organized components on a piece of clean rag on the workbench. "I'll eat later." "You've been going for 2 hours. There's food. My guys put something together." Marcus straightened up and became aware in the way that happens when you stop focusing on the work that he was in fact very hungry. He also became aware looking around the garage that something had shifted while he'd been focused on the carburetor. His garage, his nearly empty, falling apart, soon-to-be-lost garage, had been quietly transformed. Someone had organized the space moving the bikes he wasn't working on into a neat configuration along the north wall to give him more room to maneuver. The tools he'd put down and picked up and put down again during the course of the night had been arranged on the bench in logical groupings that reflected how he actually worked, which told him that whoever had done it had been paying close enough attention to understand his process. The floor around the work area had been swept, an almost pointless task in a wet night, but done nonetheless. Near the side door, someone had set up a folding table that Marcus recognized as having come from his own storage room in the back. He hadn't used it in years, and on it were food containers and a camp stove and a pot of something that was steaming. He walked over to the table. "Where did this come from?" he asked. A woman stood at the camp stove. Marcus hadn't registered her until this moment. She'd been in the back near Walt for most of the evening. She was somewhere around 50, with close-cropped silver hair, and the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor living into something striking and capable. She was stirring something in the pot with a focus that Marcus recognized as the same kind of focus he gave to mechanical problems. "We travel prepared," she said without looking up from the pot. "Soup, real soup, not the powder kind. I make it and freeze it in portions, brings it back up on the stove in about 20 minutes. She glanced at him then. "You going to stand there or you going to have some?" "I'm going to have some," Marcus said. "I'm Marcus." "Diana," she said. "Walt's my husband." Marcus looked toward the back of the garage where he could see Walt still sitting in the chair, color now fully restored, talking to Junior, with what appeared to be considerable animation. "Better, significantly better." "He's doing well," Marcus said. "He's always doing well," Diana said with the flat affection of a woman who had spent decades managing a man who routinely insisted he was fine under conditions that empirically demonstrated otherwise. "That doesn't mean he always is." She poured soup into a mug and handed it to Marcus. "Eat. Your hands are shaking slightly." Marcus looked at his hands. She was right. He hadn't noticed. "Blood sugar," he said. "I know," she said. "Eat." He ate. It was somewhere around 11:15 when Riley found the photographs. Marcus was back at work on the clutch plates he'd solved the carburetor problem an hour ago, which had required fabricating one component by modifying a part from his personal stock in a way that would make a factory mechanic wince, but would hold for considerably more than the miles these bikes needed when he heard Riley's voice from the far side of the garage with a different quality in it. Marcus? He didn't look up immediately. He was at a delicate point with the clutch pack. Marcus, what are these? He looked up. Riley was standing at the south wall. The wall Marcus had stopped seeing years ago because it was just there, just part of the background of the space he had occupied so long that it had become invisible to him. Riley was holding his phone up using the flashlight, looking at the wall with an expression Marcus couldn't read from across the bay. Marcus set down his tools and walked over. The wall was covered in photographs. Not hung neatly, not framed, not organized in any deliberate way. They'd accumulated over decades, tacked up and taped up and pinned up as they came overlapping at the edges. Some of them faded to near illegibility and some of them still clear. Each photograph showed a motorcycle, and beneath each photograph in Marcus's handwriting was a name, not the motorcycle's name, the owner's name. Jerry Paxton, 1989. Sheila Rourke, 1993. The Garfield Boys, summer of 1997. Bobby Tran, 2001. On and on, hundreds of them covering the entire wall from about shoulder height to nearly the ceiling. Riley stood in front of this wall with his phone light moving slowly across it. These are all bikes you worked on, he asked. Most of them, Marcus said. A few were bikes I wanted to work on and never got the chance. I always could tell a good machine by the photograph. Why the names? Marcus considered the question. It wasn't one he'd been asked before because he'd never particularly invited people to look at the wall. Because the bikes weren't mine, he said finally. They belonged to people. The people mattered more than the machines. I wanted to remember that. Riley looked at him for a long moment. How many years is this? 38 years of this garage. Some from before that. How many people? Marcus shook his head. I stopped counting around 300. That was a long time ago. Riley turned back to the wall. His phone light stopped on a photograph near the upper left corner, one of the older ones, the color faded to orange and brown. He leaned closer. This bike, he said quietly. This is a... He stopped, looked more carefully. Where did you get this photograph? Marcus looked at where Riley was pointing. The photograph was one of the first ones he'd put on the wall back in 1988, and it showed a motorcycle unlike almost anything else on that wall, a custom-built machine with an engine design that Marcus had drafted himself on paper over the course of 6 months of thinking and sketching and calculation, and then built over the following year, in which had been the single most complex piece of work he'd ever done. He hadn't built it for money. He'd built it because the design had been in his head and it needed to come out. I took that photograph, Marcus said. That's my work. Riley turned around and looked at him with an expression that was no longer unreadable. It was recognition. You built that engine, Riley said. It wasn't a question. I did. Riley stopped, pulled out his phone, again started doing something on it. What year? 88. Finished it in the spring of 89. Sold it to a collector out of Nashville for enough money to pay off the first year on this building. Riley found what he was looking for on his phone and held the screen out to Marcus. It was a photograph, a different photograph, taken from a different angle showing the same motorcycle in what appeared to be some kind of exhibition setting surrounded by people. Marcus stared at it. He hadn't seen this photograph before. Where is this from? He asked. That bike has been in 4 national shows, Riley said. It's considered, Marcus, that engine design was replicated. Modified, but the core concept is yours. Mechanics have been calling it the hollow frame variation for 20 years without knowing where it came from. Marcus looked at the photograph for a long time. I didn't know that, he said. I know you didn't. Riley's voice had something careful in it. That's not the kind of thing that usually gets back to the person it started with. Marcus handed the phone back. He stood looking at the wall of photographs at 38 years of names and machines and people he'd tried to serve well. He thought about the eviction notice in his toolbox and the $47 in his account and the coffee he'd just used the last of to give to 17 strangers. And he thought about the engine design that had apparently been living a life of its own for 20 years in a world he'd stepped away from. He thought about Evelyn. He thought about their son James, who had died at 31 of a cardiac event that nobody had seen coming, and who had been the person Marcus had imagined handing this garage to when the time came, and whose absence had been the thing that had quietly hollowed out the last decade and a half of Marcus's life in a way he'd never fully explained to anyone. He turned away from the wall. I've still got bikes to fix, he said, and he went back to work. By 1 in the morning, 5 of the 7 broken motorcycles were running. The shop had settled into a particular late-night rhythm that Marcus recognized from years of long jobs, the sound of someone asleep against the wall, the low conversation of people who'd stopped performing wakefulness and were just talking, the smell of engine oil and coffee, and the soup that Diana had kept warm on the camp stove for anyone who wanted it. Someone had found Marcus's old portable radio on the shelf by the utility sink and turned it on at low volume, a country station out of Cookville, playing the kind of music that nobody under 50 would admit to enjoying. Marcus sat on the floor beside the 6th bike and worked. His knees hurt. They'd been hurting for years, and he'd long since stopped treating it as information worth acting on. His lower back had a complaint it registered every 45 minutes or so, and then went quiet again. His hands felt good, which was the important thing, which was always the thing that mattered most. His hands at 67 in the middle of the night, on the 6th consecutive motorcycle repair of the evening, still felt good. Riley sat on a metal stool 6 feet away and watched him work. He'd been there for about an hour without saying much. Marcus had initially assumed he'd leave and hadn't given it particular thought, and then the hour had passed and Riley was still there, and Marcus had started to notice it in the peripheral way that you notice something that should have moved on and hasn't. "You can go sleep somewhere if you want," Marcus said without looking up from the chain he was adjusting. "I don't need watching." "I know you don't," Riley said. "Then why are you sitting there?" A pause. "Because I want to know something and I haven't figured out how to ask it yet." Marcus kept his hands moving. "How old are you?" 56. "By 56, you should be able to ask most things directly." Another pause. "What made you stop?" Riley asked. "Building, designing, the work you were doing before all of this." Marcus's hands kept moving. The chain needed 2 links taken out, and he counted links and felt for the master link and found it. "Life," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the answer I have." He worked the master link loose. "I had reasons that were mine. I stepped away. I kept doing the work that was in front of me, and I let the rest go." "The rest didn't let you go," Riley said quietly. "That engine design has been cited in—" "I know what you told me," Marcus said. He wasn't sharp about it. He was just clear. "I appreciate it. I mean that. But a man can know something mattered and still have chosen to step away from it, and both of those things can be true at the same time." Riley was quiet for a while. "Your son," he said. Marcus's hands paused for just a fraction of a second. Then they kept moving. "How do you know about James?" he asked. "Diana's been talking to Walt. Walt knows people who knew you. He's been putting pieces together all evening." Riley paused. "I'm sorry, I should have asked whether you wanted to know that." "It's all right." Marcus set the chain tool down and sat back on his heels. "James was the reason I stopped. He was the reason I was going to start again. And then he wasn't there anymore. And I kept the shop going because the shop was something I could keep going. It didn't require me to dream about the future. It just required me to show up." He picked the chain tool back up. "So I kept showing up," he said. The radio played something slow and old that Marcus half recognized from a long time ago. Outside, the rain was still coming down softer now, the storm beginning to lose its energy, moving east toward the mountains. "You're extraordinary at this," Riley said. "At what's right in front of you. Whatever you're working on at this moment, you give it everything." "That's how it should be," Marcus said. "Whatever's in front of you, that's the work." "I know," Riley said. "I've been watching you for 3 hours." Marcus looked at him, then directly for the first time since Riley had sat down on the stool. "Why?" he asked. Not suspicious, genuinely curious. Riley looked back at him steadily. In the flat light of the garage with the rain outside and the radio at low volume, his expression was serious in a way that Marcus hadn't seen on him before. "Because we heard a story about a mechanic in Redwood Creek who could fix anything and who never turned anyone away and who had been quietly doing extraordinary work for 40 years without expecting anything back." He paused. "We wanted to see if the story was true." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "And," he said. Riley didn't answer right away. He looked at the wall of photographs. He looked at the 5 motorcycles now sitting repaired and ready in the bay. He looked at Walt sleeping now with the emergency blanket still around his shoulders, Diana dozing in the chair beside him, holding his hand in her sleep. "And," Riley said finally, "the story was true." Marcus held his gaze for another moment. Then he picked up the chain tool and went back to work. The seventh motorcycle would be running before dawn. He was sure of it. He could already hear what it needed, the way you hear music, the way your hands know a job before your mind has finished asking the question. Outside, the rain was gentling. Inside, the garage held its warmth. And Marcus Holloway, 67 years old in the last weeks of the space he'd built his life inside, worked through the small hours with his hands that still felt good, and his wall of names at his back, and the only sound besides the radio and the rain was the clean, focused sound of work being done well. The seventh motorcycle started at 4:53 in the morning. Marcus heard the engine catch and settle into its idle, the way he always heard it, not with pride exactly, but with something quieter and more durable than pride, the particular satisfaction of a problem that has been correctly understood and correctly answered. He held the throttle steady for 30 seconds, listening for anything that wasn't right, and there was nothing that wasn't right. The engine ran clean. He cut the ignition and sat back on his stool and put his hands on his knees and stayed that way for a moment. The garage had gone almost completely quiet sometime around 3. The riders who weren't hurt had found spaces on the floor and against the walls using their own jackets and bedrolls from their saddlebags. And most of them were sleeping now, with the uncomplicated thoroughness of people who had been cold and wet and frightened and were now warm and safe and had allowed their bodies to take over. Diana was still in the chair beside Walt, both of them asleep, her head resting against his shoulder. Junior had fallen asleep sitting up against the south wall with his arms crossed and his chin on his chest, directly below the photograph wall, and Marcus looked at him for a moment and thought about the photograph of the engine Riley had found. He thought about what Riley had said. The story was true. Marcus wasn't sure what to do with that. He'd spent 15 years believing in the dull, unchallenged way that you believe things you've stopped examining, that the world he'd been part of had simply moved on without him, the way worlds do, the way everything does eventually. You step away and the current closes over the space you occupied, and it's as if you were never there. He'd told himself that wasn't bitterness, it was just reality, the natural order of things. The way he'd explained to himself why it no longer hurt to think about the design work in the building in the years when his name had meant something in a certain community of people. But Riley had said 20 years. The design had been alive and circulating and cited and argued about for 20 years, and Marcus hadn't known. Because nobody had told him, and nobody had told him because he'd gone quiet, and the quiet had become invisible, and the invisible eventually becomes forgotten. Or at least, that's what he'd believed. Apparently, he'd been wrong about that. He was still sitting with his hands on his knees when he heard Riley's voice behind him. "You finished it." Marcus didn't turn around. "About 10 minutes ago. Needed to be sure it would hold it idle before I said anything. And it'll hold." He heard Riley move closer, heard the man crouch down to look at the engine. Chain on this one was the easy part. The real problem was a fuel tank pickup that had corroded enough to restrict flow. I almost missed it. "But you didn't." "No." Marcus finally turned around. Riley was crouched beside the bike, looking at the engine with an expression that Marcus was starting to recognize, the expression of a man who understood mechanical things well enough to appreciate what he was looking at, but who understood them differently than Marcus did from the outside rather than the inside. I caught it because I was listening for why the carb rebuild hadn't fully fixed the hesitation. Something upstream turned out to be the pickup. Riley nodded slowly. He reached out and touched the engine casing lightly with 2 fingers. The way people sometimes touch things they're trying to make real. 7 bikes in one night, he said, with what you had available. 6.5, Marcus said. The clutch on the blue side off tail is temporary. Functional but temporary. That rider needs proper plates before he puts serious miles on it. I'll make sure he knows. Make sure he does it soon, not eventually. Airbnb. There's a difference. Riley looked at him. You always talk to people like that. Like what? Like the information matters and they should treat it accordingly. Marcus considered that. I suppose I do, he said, because it does and they should. Riley stood up from his crouch. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way Marcus had started to recognize as Riley organizing something he wanted to say into the form he wanted to say it. The man didn't speak carelessly. Marcus had noticed that early, and it had raised his estimation of him. Can I ask you something? Riley said. You've been asking me things all night. This one's different, Ed. Marcus waited. When did you last sleep? Marcus blinked. Of everything he'd expected Riley to say that hadn't been on the list. Last night, I sleep every night. When did you last sleep? Well, the questions sat in the air between them. Marcus looked at Riley for a moment and then looked away back at the bike at the engine he'd just spent 4 hours diagnosing and repairing. Outside, the rain had stopped sometime in the last hour. In the silence its absence left felt new and fragile. That's a different kind of question, Marcus said. I know it is. A long time, Marcus said finally. A long time since I slept well. Riley nodded. He didn't follow it up, didn't push toward whatever he might have been building toward, just let the answer be what it was. Marcus found himself unexpectedly grateful for that. Go sleep, Riley said. We're not going anywhere before sunrise. There's nothing left that needs doing tonight. I'm not tired. Marcus. I said I'm not tired. Riley looked at him steadily. Your hands are shaking again. Marcus looked down at his hands. They were in fact trembling slightly, a fine constant tremor that wasn't pain and wasn't cold, but was simply the physical consequence of having been awake for 22 hours and having used himself up in the particular way that deep focused work uses a person. He closed his hands and the tremor disappeared, but they both knew it was still there underneath. There's a cot in the back office, Marcus said after a moment. I keep it for long jobs. Good. 2 hours, Marcus said. That's all. However long you need. Marcus stood up from the stool. His knees registered their opinion of this. He walked toward the back office and stopped in the doorway and turned around. Riley. Yeah. Thank you for moving the bikes earlier and for organizing the bench. Whoever did that, they understood how I work. Riley was quiet for a beat. Tommy did the bench. He watched you for about an hour before he figured out the system. Marcus thought about the 26-year-old with the bandaged forearm who had insisted the gash was fine. He's got a good eye, Marcus said. He does, Riley said. Get some sleep. Marcus went and lay down on the cot in the back office on top of the blanket because he didn't want to take the time to get under it, and he was asleep in under 3 minutes. He dreamed about James, not the difficult dreams he usually had when his son came to him at night, the ones that centered on the phone call, on the particular quality of the silence on the line before the words came on the hospital room, and the decisions that had been too late to make differently. This dream was earlier. James was maybe 12 years old, and he was sitting on an overturned milk crate in this same garage, watching his father work on an engine, asking questions with the relentless, focused curiosity of a child who has found the thing that interests him most in the world. Why does that one do that? James asked. Because everything has a reason, Marcus told him in the dream. You just have to be patient enough to find it. What if you can't find it? Then you keep looking. You don't stop. You be quiet and you listen and you keep looking. What are you listening for? For what it needs, Marcus said. Everything that's broken is telling you what it needs. You just have to learn to hear it. He woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of voices. The light coming through the small window above the cot was the early gray gold of a Tennessee morning after shin, the kind of light that has a washed, clean quality. Everything slightly more vivid than it has any right to be. Marcus lay still for a moment and listened. The voices were in the main bay, several of them quiet but active with a purposeful quality, not the loose conversation of people waking up and orienting themselves, but something more organized. He got up. His back made its usual morning argument. He ignored it the way you ignore a colleague who always says the same thing, splashed water on his face from the utility sink in the corner of the office, and walked out into the bay. What he found stopped him in the doorway. 8 of the riders who had been sleeping were now up and working. Not working on motorcycles, working on the garage itself. 2 men had climbed up on the workbench and were doing something to the section of the roof near the east wall where Marcus had been watching a slow rust-through develop for 2 years. 1 man was on his hands and knees near the back of the bay with a tube of sealant he'd apparently found somewhere working along the joint between the floor and the base of the north wall where water had been getting in. Another was on a ladder Marcus didn't recognize. They'd apparently produced it from somewhere working on the exterior framing of the bay door, which had been pulling away from the wall and would need proper attention eventually, but which this man was addressing with a speed and competence that suggested he knew what he was doing. Tommy was at the workbench. He had Marcus's tools arranged in front of him and was cleaning them, not cursorily, not wiping them down with a rag, but properly cleaning them, disassembling the ones that could be disassembled, working out the built-up grease from the joints, clearly using the correct cleaning fluid because Marcus could smell it from the doorway. He was doing it with the focused, quiet intensity of someone who had been at it for a while. Diana was at the camp stove, coffee and something that smelled like actual food eggs, Marcus thought, which seemed improbable given the circumstances, until he remembered that these were people who traveled prepared. Marcus stood in the doorway and looked at all of this. He didn't know what to say. He didn't say anything. He walked to the workbench and stood beside Tommy and looked at what the young man was doing, and Tommy glanced up at him briefly and then went back to work. "You don't have to do that," Marcus said. "I know," Tommy said. "Your socket set was starting to pit at the joints. If you don't get the moisture out, it'll rust through the chrome and then they're compromised." "I know that," Marcus said more gently than it might have sounded. "I figured you knew." Tommy used a pick to work something out of a ratchet mechanism. But knowing and having the time are different things. Marcus watched him work for a moment. The kid was careful, not careful the way beginners are careful. All deliberateness and hesitation, but careful the way people are careful when they know what they're doing and respect the work. "Where did you learn to do that?" Marcus asked. "My grandfather had a shop in Biloxi," Tommy said. "Automotive, not motorcycles, but the principles are the same." He set down the ratchet and picked up a torque wrench. "He died when I was 16. Shop closed." He ran the cleaning cloth along the length of the wrench with particular attention to the calibration housing. "I missed it for a long time." Marcus pulled up a stool and sat down. "What did you do instead?" "A lot of wrong things," Tommy said with the candor of someone who has passed through that stage and can look back at it from solid ground. "Took me a while to get here." "Here being?" Tommy gestured vaguely toward the bay, where the other riders were working. "Here," he said again in a different tone, meaning the group, meaning the community, meaning whatever it was that had brought 17 people through a Tennessee rainstorm to an old garage and caused them, when they woke up in that garage, to start fixing the things they saw were broken. Marcus looked at the group of men working on his roof, his walls, his door. He was 67 years old and he had seen generosity in many forms, had been on the giving end of it far more than the receiving end, and had preferred it that way, had in fact built his entire adult life around the preference for giving over receiving, because receiving required a vulnerability that he'd mostly shut down in the years after James. But this specific form of it, people seeing what needed doing and simply doing it without announcement or request, without transaction or expectation, this landed somewhere different. He stood up from the stool. "Diana," he said, raising his voice across the bay. She looked over from the camp stove. "Is there enough of whatever you're making for everyone?" "I brought enough for 20, she said. "I always bring enough for 20. "Why 20? "Because Riley always says there will be 17 and there are always more." She said it with the weary affection of a woman who has been proved right enough at times to have stopped being surprised by it. Marcus almost smiled. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked around his garage, his repaired, attended to, occupied garage. And he thought about the eviction notice in the toolbox and decided for this morning, at least, to leave it there. Breakfast happened the way good meals do in working spaces, standing up or sitting on whatever was available in fragments and shifts as people came and went from what they were doing. Diana made eggs with canned peppers and something from a spice kit she produced from a saddlebag that turned out to have a surprising number of components, and there was coffee, and there was the last of a bread loaf that someone had been carrying in a sealed bag. And it was the kind of meal that tasted better than its components had any right to produce. Walt ate sitting up in the chair, properly dressed now, in dry clothes, colorfully restored, moving with the carefully measured confidence of a man who had agreed to let his body have the lead for a little while longer. He ate with concentration and didn't speak much, which Diana had told Marcus was a reliable indicator that Walt was feeling well enough to be self-conscious about the previous night. "He hates being fussed over," she said to Marcus quietly while she refilled his coffee. "When he's really bad, he'll accept help. When he's recovering, he pretends it never happened." "Sounds like most men I've known," Marcus said. "Sounds like most people," she said, and looked at him with a directness that made Marcus suspect she wasn't talking only about Walt. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked away back at his coffee. Riley hadn't eaten yet. He was outside. Marcus could see him through the open bay door, standing in the gravel lot on the phone, his back to the garage, moving slowly in a tight circle. The way people move when they're having a conversation that requires some physical outlet for the mental energy it's consuming. He'd been out there for the better part of 20 minutes. Marcus watched him through the open door and thought about the question Riley had asked in the middle of the night, the one about sleeping well. He'd answered it honestly and then let it go, and Riley had let it go too. But Marcus found now in the morning light that he was turning the question over in a way he hadn't expected to. A long time since I slept well. He'd said it without intending to say it. It was simply the true answer, and it had come out the way true answers sometimes do when you've been awake for 20 hours and your defenses have tired themselves out. But the dream had been different from his usual dreams. James at 12 asking questions in the garage learning. The dream had not been about loss. It had been about continuity. He was still thinking about this when Riley came back inside. Riley's expression had changed. Not dramatically, he was not a man who wore his emotional weather on his face, but enough that Marcus, who had been reading people in his garage for 38 years, caught it immediately. Something in the conversation outside had landed differently than Riley had expected. "Problem?" Marcus asked. Riley looked at him, made a decision. "I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how to say it without it sounding." He stopped, started differently. "Do you know who we are, the group? I mean, not just that we're bikers. I know you're Hell's Angels. I can read a patch. Do you know this chapter specifically? The people in this room." Marcus looked around the bay. He looked at the men on the roof, at Tommy, cleaning tools at Junior, who had woken up and was now helping with the door frame at Walt and Diana. He looked back at Riley. "I know you're people who needed a door opened last night," Marcus said. "That's what I needed to know." Riley looked at him for a moment with an expression that mixed something like frustration with something that might have been respect. "That's a genuine answer," he said, "but I need you to hear me now because there's a piece of this you're missing and it matters." He sat down on the stool Tommy had vacated and leaned forward with his forearms on his knees. "This group, the people in this garage right now, includes 4 people who sit on the board of the American Motorcycle Heritage Foundation. Walt is one of them. 2 of my riders are master builders with national reputations. Deacon," he gestured toward the big man with the immobilized shoulder who was eating with his good arm and watching the roof repair with critical focus. Deacon restored 3 bikes that are currently in the Smithsonian collection. Marcus looked at Deacon, then back at Riley. "And you?" Marcus asked. Riley was quiet for a moment. "I chair the Heritage Foundation." Marcus absorbed this. "The organization that manages documentation and recognition of significant contributions to American motorcycle history," Riley continued. "The organization that has been trying for 11 years to locate the original builder of the hollow frame engine design." The garage was not silent. There were still sounds of work, of conversation across the bay, but it felt silent to Marcus in this moment. He sat with Riley's words and felt something shift in his chest, a slow and complicated movement, like a gear engaging after a long time of freewheeling. "You knew who I was," Marcus said, "before last night. We knew a name. We knew a town. We knew a story about a mechanic that a lot of people had told in a lot of different versions over 30 years. Riley's voice was careful. "We did not know where you were exactly. We did not know the shop was struggling. We did not know about your son." He paused. "We were in the area for a different reason, and the storm happened and the breakdowns happened, and then somebody said Redwood Creek, and I said, I know that name, and we came." "And if the storm hadn't happened?" Marcus asked. Riley held his gaze. "We would have found you," he said. "Differently, but we would have found you. The search was active." Marcus stood up from the workbench. He walked to the center of the bay and stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets, looking at his garage, at the work being done on it, at the 7 motorcycles in various states of repair, at the wall of photographs on the south wall. He could feel Riley watching him. He could feel the weight of what had just been said pressing against everything he'd built, his understanding of the past 15 years, on the belief that he had stepped away cleanly, that his stepping away had been accepted, that the world had moved on, and so had he, parallel and unconnected. 11 years, Marcus said without turning around. 11 years, Riley confirmed. Marcus turned around. "Why the design is out there? People are using it. What does it matter who built it?" "It matters because the record is wrong," Riley said. "It matters because right now the credit belongs to a man who bought the bike from the collector you sold it to, took it to 2 shows under his own name, and let the association stick. He paused. It matters because there's a mechanic in Redwood Creek, Tennessee, who invented something significant and who has been invisible for 15 years and who deserves not to be. The word invisible hit Marcus somewhere unexpected. He'd used the word himself in his own head not an hour ago. The invisible eventually becomes forgotten. Apparently not, though. Apparently it became something else entirely, something that spent 11 years being searched for. He looked at Riley for a long moment. "The man with the credit," he said. "What's his name?" Riley told him. "Riley?" Marcus knew the name. He'd sold the bike to the original collector in 1989 and hadn't thought about it much after that, and the name Riley said was not the collector's name, but a name he'd heard maybe twice in the years since peripherally in conversations he'd drifted away from. He'd never connected it to his engine. "He knows," Marcus asked. "He knows the design isn't his," Riley said. "Whether he knows the full story, whether he knows about you specifically, I can't say for certain, but the foundation has documentation. The original build photographs, the early show records, 3 witnesses from the Nashville collector community who remember the sale clearly. The record can be corrected." Marcus sat down. He sat down on the floor right there in the middle of the bay because his legs had decided they were done with the business of holding him up while he processed this, and the floor was available, and it didn't require any decision-making. He sat with his knees up and his forearms resting on them, and he looked at the floor between his feet at the oil-stained concrete that he'd been standing on for 38 years. Tommy had stopped cleaning tools. Diana had put down her spatula. The men on the roof had gone quiet. The whole garage had taken on that particular held-breath quality that happens when something important is happening, and everyone can feel it, and nobody wants to interrupt it. Riley sat down on the floor a few feet away, which Marcus hadn't expected, and which for some reason he couldn't have explained, helped. "I don't need recognition," Marcus said. The words came out rough. His throat had done something unexpected. "I know that," Riley said. "That's not why it matters." "Then why does it matter?" "Because your son knew you built it," Riley said quietly, "and I think you'd want the world to know what he knew." The garage stayed quiet. Marcus kept his eyes on the floor between his feet. He kept them there for a while, and the sounds around him, the breathing of 17 people who were politely pretending not to be paying close attention, were the only sounds in the building. And outside, a bird had started somewhere in the trees. Along the road, the particular morning bird that meant the night was fully over. He thought about James at 12 sitting on the milk crate asking, "Why does that one do that?" Everything has a reason. You just have to be patient enough to find it. "All right," Marcus said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. He put his hands flat on the floor and pushed himself back to standing, the knees registering their standard complaint, and he stood in the middle of his garage, and he looked at Riley, who had also stood. "What happens next?" Marcus asked. "Right now," Riley said. "Right now you eat something and you let my people finish fixing your door frame and your roof joint before we leave, because Junior was a contractor for 12 years, and he spotted 3 things out there that will cause you problems before winter if they're not addressed." He paused. "After that, we need to have a longer conversation. Not today. Today you need rest and I need to make some calls. But soon." "About the foundation." "About a lot of things." Riley looked at the photograph wall. "About that wall, about your knowledge, about what it would mean to have your name attached to work that already has your name on it in everything but the official record." He looked back at Marcus. "About what comes next for this garage." Marcus looked at him sharply. "What comes next for this garage is the landlord's decision, not mine." "Maybe," Riley said. "Maybe not." He said it without drama, without the particular quality that usually precedes a grand gesture, just as a simple statement of as yet unresolved possibility. And Marcus didn't push it because something in Riley's tone told him that pushing it this morning would be premature. "Eat first," Riley said. "Everything else can wait 20 minutes." Marcus went and got a plate from Diana, who put more on it than he asked for without asking whether he wanted more, and he ate it standing at the workbench, and it was the best meal he'd had in a long time, which probably said something about the past 6 months that he chose not to examine too closely right now. The writers began preparing to leave around 9 in the morning. It happened with the particular organized efficiency of a group that had done this many times, the methodical restoring of order gear going back into saddlebags, borrowed space being returned to something close to its original configuration, the camp stove broken down and packed, the folding table folded and returned to Marcus's storage room. The men who'd been working on the roof came down and cleaned up after themselves with a thoroughness that suggested they'd been taught that leaving a space better than you found it was not optional. Walt was on his feet and moving steadier than Marcus had expected him to be, accepting Dinah's hand under his arm with the slightly theatrical resignation of a man who knows the argument is not worth having. He stopped in front of Marcus before he went outside. He was a tall man, older than Marcus had initially registered looking at him in the poor light of the previous night, closer to 70 than 68, with a face that had accumulated its years in the particular way that faces do when the years have contained real things, real difficulty, real satisfaction. His eyes were sharp in a way that didn't match the careful way he was moving his body. "I owe you," Walt said. "You don't," Marcus said. "I do." Walt said it with the flat certainty of a man who did not intend to be contradicted on this particular point. "You kept my wife from spending the night terrified in a roadside emergency. You sat with me and talked about the Blue Ridge until I came back to myself. You did that without being asked and without any indication that it was anything other than the natural thing to do." He extended his right hand. "I know who you are, Marcus. I've known about your work for years. I'm sorry it took a rainstorm to bring us to your door." Marcus shook his hand. Walt's grip was firm and deliberate and lasted a beat longer than a standard handshake, the kind that means the handshake is a statement. "The Blue Ridge is still worth the ride," Marcus said. Walt looked at him steadily. "We'll do it together sometime." He said it the way people sometimes say things they intend to do, rather than the way people say things to fill the space where a goodbye goes, and Marcus registered the difference. Deacon came through next right, arm moving freely. Left still immobilized, and shook Marcus's hand without stopping, because the big man appeared to operate on a policy of never making more ceremony than necessary. "You do good work," he said, and kept walking, and Marcus thought that coming from a man who'd restored motorcycles for the Smithsonian, that was probably enough. The riders he hadn't spoken to much came through in a loose sequence, names he caught some of, and missed others' faces that registered as distinct individuals rather than a group, the way people always individuate once you've spent the night with them. Each one said something thank you in various forms, which Marcus accepted with more grace than he might have managed the previous night. Before the things Riley had told him had rearranged something about what he understood this night to have been. Tommy came last. He'd finished with the tools. They were laid out on the workbench in the arrangement he'd constructed, and Marcus had looked at them while he was eating and recognized immediately that the arrangement was more logical than his own previous system, which was somewhat humbling and also just correct. "Your grandfather would have approved of how you clean a socket set," Marcus said. Tommy looked at the bench. Something shifted in his face, the young man's deliberate calm, breaking slightly, going to something younger and less guarded. "He was thorough," Tommy said. "You learned it right." Tommy looked at him directly, then the way young people sometimes do when they're deciding whether to say the thing they're actually thinking. He decided to say it. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How do you keep doing at the work when everything around it is—" He gestured at the garage, the eviction notice he couldn't know about, but whose existence was legible in the general condition of things, when everything else is in the direction of stopping. Marcus thought about it. He thought about it genuinely, not reaching for the answer that would sound right, but looking for the answer that was true. "Because the work doesn't know about everything else," he said. "The bike doesn't know the shop is in trouble. The engine doesn't know I'm tired. They just need what they need, and if I can give it, I give it. The rest," he paused, "the rest is just noise you learn to work through." Tommy absorbed this. He nodded once slowly, the nod of someone taking something seriously enough not to respond to immediately. "Thank you," he said. He meant it for more than the bandage. "Get that arm looked at today," Marcus said. Tommy almost smiled. "Yes, sir." He went outside. Marcus stood in the open bay door and watched them leave. 17 motorcycles' engines running clean, all of them. Everyone moving out of his gravel lot in the same loose formation they'd arrived in, except now they moved differently, with the ease of machines that had been attended to and people who had rested. The morning had gone to full daylight by now, the Tennessee sky, after the rain, doing its particular version of blue high and clear, and washed through with the kind of light that makes everything look like it might be worth something. Riley was the last to mount up. He pulled on his helmet, then stopped and walked back to where Marcus was standing in the doorway. I meant what I said about the conversation, Riley said. I'll call you this week. I don't have much of a phone situation, Marcus said. The plan's basic. Then I'll come back. Riley said it without qualification. Don't make any permanent decisions about this space before we talk. Marcus looked at him. The decision about this space isn't mine to make. It might be, Riley said. Give me a week. He extended his hand. You opened your door when you had no reason to. That means something. Not just to me, to all of them. He gestured toward the line of waiting motorcycles. They're going to talk about this night. People are going to hear about what you did here. I fixed some bikes, Marcus said. In my shop. That's not a story. That's not all you did, Riley said, and you know it. Marcus held his gaze. He did know it in the way you know things you haven't fully articulated, the way the truth of a thing precedes your ability to put language around it. He had fixed the bikes. He had also opened the door. He had also given his last coffee and his dry clothes and his time and his hands and something harder to name, some quality of attention, of care, of seeing each person and each machine as worthy of his best, and he had given all of that without calculation, without expectation, without the small internal ledger that most people maintain even when they're being generous. And something had come back from it that he hadn't expected. Not the recognition, not the foundation, not the 11 years of searching, not even the knowledge that his engine design had been living its own life in the world. Something simpler than that. The dream of James at 12. The tool arrangement that was better than his own. Walt's hand on the Blue Ridge. Diana's directness in her eggs and her 20 portions because Riley always undercounts. The specific gravity of being seen. He shook Riley's hand. 1 week, he said. 1 week, Riley confirmed. He walked back to his motorcycle, mounted up, settled himself, and pulled onto the road. The formation moved, shifted, accelerated, and then the sound of 17 engines was fading down the highway toward Cookville, thinning through distance, and then they were gone. Marcus stood in his bay door in the morning light and listened to the silence they left behind. His garage held the evidence of the night in every direction. The clean tools on the bench, the repaired roof joint, the sealed floor edge, the straightened door frame, the space that had been occupied by 17 people and was now his alone again. The coffee machine was empty and clean. The folding table was back in the storage room. The emergency blanket was folded on the chair in the back office. Marcus walked to the south wall. He stood in front of the photographs. He found the picture of the engine in the upper left corner, the faded orange and brown photograph from 1988, and he looked at it for a long time. He'd built that engine in this building on the bench that Tommy had just cleaned, with hands that were 30 years younger and a mind that was still full of the future. And James had been 12 years old and sitting on a milk crate asking questions, and Evelyn had been alive and had brought him lunch on the days he worked too long to notice he was hungry, and the world had been full of things he was going to do. He reached out and straightened the photograph. It had been sitting at a slight angle for years and he'd stopped seeing it. Now it was straight. He stepped back from the wall. He looked at the eviction notice in his toolbox. He looked at the phone on the wall, which he was going to need to use before long. He looked at his garage, at everything in it, at everything it still held, and everything it was in danger of losing. Then he went to the utility sink and washed his hands and started thinking about what needed doing today. Because the work was still the work, and he was still here. The call from the landlord came on a Tuesday. Marcus had been expecting it the way you expect a thing you have been postponing. Not with surprise, but with the specific weariness of a person who has run out of ways to delay the inevitable. He was at the workbench when his phone rang cleaning a carburetor from a neighbor's lawnmower because the neighbor had asked and Marcus had said yes, the way he always said yes to things in front of him that he could fix. And he set down the carburetor and wiped his hands and looked at the name on the screen for a moment before he answered. Mr. Holloway. Gerald Parr's voice had the particular professional warmth of a man who had learned to deliver bad news in a tone that sounded like reasonable conversation. I've been trying to reach you. I know, Marcus said. I've been meaning to call back. I understand things have been difficult. I genuinely do. A pause that Marcus recognized as the pause before the but. But I have to be straight with you. I have another tenant interested in the property. A firm out of Nashville they want to put in a chain service center. They've offered a 3-year lease at market rate, and they want to sign before the end of the month. Marcus held the phone and looked at the wall of photographs. How long do I have? He asked. Technically, your notice runs out Friday. I could stretch it to the end of next week if you needed time to clear out your equipment as a courtesy. But Marcus, another pause. I need an answer by Friday, a real answer with money attached. I'm sorry. Marcus thanked him. He said it without bitterness because Gerald Parr was not a bad man, just a man with a property and a mortgage of his own, and the kind of decision in front of him that didn't leave much room for sentiment. He hung up and set the phone on the bench and stood looking at it for a moment. Friday, 5 days. He picked up the carburetor and went back to work because there was nothing else to do with the next hour that would be more useful than finishing the job in front of him. He had not heard from Riley. It had been 6 days since the night of the storm. 6 days since Riley had stood in his doorway and said, "Give me the week," and Marcus had spent those 6 days doing what he'd always done. Working opening up in the morning, doing the jobs that came through the door, or which had been 3 small ones and 1 bigger one, enough to cover 2 weeks of groceries but nowhere close to what he owed. He had not called Riley because he didn't have Riley's number, and because calling would have felt like applying pressure to something that Riley had said he'd handle, and Marcus had spent a lifetime believing that the right way to conduct yourself was to do your own work and let other people do theirs. But Friday was Friday. He finished the carburetor, called the neighbor, and then sat on his stool for a while in the middle of the afternoon quiet of the garage and thought about what clearing out looked like. 38 years of tools, the photograph wall, the cot in the back office, the coffee machine, the things that had accumulated over decades of a life lived in one place, the layers of presence that objects take on when they've been part of a routine long enough to become inseparable from it. He thought about his son standing at this bench. He put his hands flat on the surface of the workbench and pushed himself up and went to the phone on the wall, the landline, because that was still what he had and what he trusted, and dialed the number for the American Motorcycle Heritage Foundation that he'd looked up 2 days after the storm and written on a piece of paper and tucked under the coffee machine. It rang 4 times and went to a recorded message. He left his name and his number and said that he was looking for Riley Carter and that if someone could pass the message along, he would appreciate it. He said please, and he said thank you, and he hung up. Then he went back to the workbench and picked up the next thing. The next morning, a truck pulled into his lot. Not a motorcycle, not a car, a pickup truck. Older model, dark blue Tennessee plates, and it parked without ceremony, and a man got out that Marcus didn't recognize. Medium height, maybe 50, with the compact, deliberate movements of someone who spent a lot of time working with his hands. He walked up to the open bay door and looked in. "Marcus Holloway," he asked. "That's me. My name's Garrett. Danny Garrett. I ride with Riley Carter. I wasn't there last week. I was in Atlanta for a family thing." He paused. "Riley asked me to come by. He's been trying to reach you, but your cell goes straight to—" "The cell will pay as you go," Marcus said. "It runs out." Garrett absorbed this without commentary. "He got your message this morning. He's been dealing with something that couldn't wait, but he wanted someone here in person. So he called me." He looked around the garage with the evaluating look of someone who was seeing a space through the lens of a specific question. "He said you might be running out of time on this place." "Friday," Marcus said. Garrett went still. "Friday as in this Friday." "Friday as in 3 days from now." Garrett pulled out his phone and started doing something on it. "Riley's going to want to know that specifically," he said, more to himself than to Marcus. He typed something, waited, typed again. His phone made a sound. He looked at the screen and then looked at Marcus. "He says he's sorry. He says the timeline moved faster than he expected, and he should have anticipated it." "Tell him it's all right," Marcus said. "He doesn't owe me anything." Garrett looked up from his phone. He looked at Marcus with the particular expression of a man receiving information that conflicts with what he'd been told to expect. "He said you'd say something like that," Garrett said. "He also said to tell you that's not the right way to think about it, and that you should give him until tomorrow morning. The landlord needs an answer by Friday. He knows. He says tomorrow-ish morning." Garrett put his phone in his pocket. "He also asked me to look at the space while I'm here, if that's all right with you. Get him accurate dimensions, take some photographs of the structure." Marcus looked at him. "What for?" "He'll explain tomorrow." Garrett met his gaze. "I know that's not a satisfying answer, but I've known Riley Carter for 19 years, and if he says tomorrow morning is when things will be clear." A pause. "Can I look around?" Marcus considered it. He considered the 5 days he had and the 3 days now, and the phone call he'd left, and the 6 days of silence before it, and the fact that a man he didn't know had driven out from wherever he'd driven from because Riley had called him this morning. He considered the question of what he had to lose by saying yes. "Look around," he said. Garrett was thorough. He moved through the garage with a measuring tape and a notebook, doing things Marcus didn't follow completely, but which had the systematic quality of someone who understood buildings, foundation, load points, the roof, the electrical panel, the plumbing, in the utility area. He spent a long time on the section of roof that Junior had addressed in the early morning after the storm, checking what Junior had done, checking what remained. He went outside and walked the perimeter and came back in with his notebook full of numbers that he photographed with his phone. He did all of this quietly, not asking for explanations, not offering observations, just working. Marcus watched him from the bench and found himself unable to entirely suppress the hope that had been sitting in his chest since the morning of the storm. The small, persistent warmth of it, the thing he'd been telling himself was premature and probably misplaced, and that he should not allow himself to build anything on top of, because the architecture of disappointment is built exactly that way. Hope upon hope upon hope until the structure collapses. He'd been disappointed before. He knew how it felt coming and how it felt going, but the hope was still there. When Garrett finished, he came and stood in front of Marcus with his notebook. "Good bones," he said. "The space is solid. The roof needs real work beyond what Junior did. Junior stabilized it, but it needs a proper job, 2 or 3 days of real work. The electrical panel is 30 years old and undersized for what Riley's thinking. The floor is fine." He paused. "The location is actually ideal, better than what I expected." "Ideal for what?" Marcus asked. Garrett looked at him. He seemed to be deciding how much was his to say. "Riley will explain tomorrow," he said again. "I know that's frustrating." "It's not frustrating," Marcus said, and surprised himself by meaning that. "I've waited 38 years to understand why most things happened. I can wait until tomorrow morning." Garrett looked at him for a moment with what appeared to be genuine respect. "Riley said you were something," he said. "He wasn't wrong." He closed his notebook. "He'll be here at 8. That's not his usual hour. 8 is early for Riley, so you'll know he means it." He went back to his truck and drove out of the lot, and Marcus stood in his bay door and watched him go, and then went back inside and stood at the workbench and put his hands flat on the surface again and stayed that way for a while. Tomorrow at 8. He picked up the carburetor again. There was still work to do today. He didn't sleep well that night, which was honest and expected, and which he didn't fight. He lay on his bed at home, the house on Crestview that he'd shared with Evelyn for 26 years, and had lived in alone for the 14 years since the house that was paid for and was therefore the one solid thing in his current financial picture, and he looked at the ceiling and let his mind do what it needed to do. He thought about the conversation with Riley in the middle of the garage floor, about the 11 years of searching, about the name Riley had given him, the man who had been taking credit for the hollow frame design, and the cold, specific anger he'd felt when he heard it, which had surprised him because he'd believed he was past the age of cold, specific anger about things he couldn't change. He was apparently not past that age. He thought about what the foundation could actually do. He thought about what correcting the record meant in practical terms, whether it changed anything tangible about his life, whether recognition at 67 was different from recognition at 37, whether being seen after 15 years of invisibility landed the same way it would have landed at the time, or whether it arrived now as something quieter, more complicated, carrying with it both the satisfaction of accuracy restored and the weight of all the years it had taken. He thought about James, the thing Riley had said. "Your son knew you built it. I think you'd want the world to know what he knew." He'd said all right. He'd meant it then, and he still meant it now lying in the dark, but the meaning of it had deepened in the days since the way things deepen when you carry them around and stop looking directly at them and let the peripheral vision do its work. James had known. James had sat on that milk crate at 12 years old and watched his father build something extraordinary, and had grown up understanding that his father's hands were capable of extraordinary things. And then James had died at 31 and taken that specific knowledge with him, and Marcus had never had, not once in 15 years, considered that someone else might know it too. Someone had. 11 years of someone knowing it. He fell asleep sometime around 3 and woke at 6:30 and was in the garage by 7:15 because there was no point in not being early when you know something significant is coming. He made coffee. The bag he'd bought to replace the one he'd given the riders was a different brand, slightly cheaper, and it made a noticeably inferior cup. But he drank it without complaint because it was coffee and it was morning, and the principle of the thing held regardless of the specifics. Riley arrived at 7:52. He was not alone. Ashamed. The car that followed Riley's motorcycle into the lot was a dark sedan, older, but well-maintained, and the man who got out of it was someone Marcus didn't recognize. 60s slight, wearing a jacket that had nothing to do with motorcycles, carrying a leather folder under his arm. He had the careful movements of someone who exists primarily in offices and treats physical spaces as slightly foreign territory. Riley came in first, pulled off his helmet, shook Marcus's hand with a grip that said the week had mattered, and he knew it. "I'm sorry about the delay," he said. "The thing I was dealing with, it's actually connected to why I'm here now. It moved faster than I expected, and it opened a door I didn't think we'd have this quickly." "All right," Marcus said. "This is Howard Marsh." Riley indicated the man with the leather folder. "Howard is an attorney. He works with the Foundation on property and intellectual property matters." Howard Marsh extended his hand and Marcus shook it. The man's grip was professional, not weak, not aggressive, just precisely calibrated. "Mr. Holloway, Riley has told me quite a bit about you." "Then you have an advantage," Marcus said. "Oeta, sit down, both of you." They sat on the available stools. Marcus remained standing, not from dominance, but from the simple fact that he thought better on his feet, and whatever was about to happen was going to require his best thinking. "Tell me," Marcus said. Riley leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, the posture Marcus already recognized as Riley being direct. "Two things happened this week. The first one you're not going to like. The second one might change everything." "Start with the one I'm not going to like," Marcus said. Riley nodded. "The man holding credit for your engine design, the man I named the other night, his name surfaced in a Foundation review we've been doing on attribution discrepancies. There are 3 designs in the current recognized record that have questionable provenance, not just yours. When the review results leaked internally, he moved quickly. He's trying to establish his claim more formally. File documentation, get ahead of what he knows is coming." Riley paused. "Which means the window to correct the record before his formal claim is in the system is shorter than we thought. Howard has been working on your documentation package since the morning after I left here." Marcus looked at Howard Marsh. "You had documentation on me before I agreed to anything." "The Foundation has been building that file for 11 years, Howard said. "It doesn't require your participation to exist. What requires your participation is using it." He opened the leather folder on his knee. "We have the original build photographs, 6 of them, pulled from the Nashville Collector's Estate records. We have purchase documentation from 1989. We have 3 signed statements from individuals who were present at the early shows and remember the work correctly." He paused. "We have your design sketches." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. "My design sketches." The collector kept them. He didn't display them. He kept them in archive storage because he recognized they were significant, even if he didn't understand exactly how significant. His estate passed them to a museum, and the museum had them in their holdings without full documentation for 9 years before our researcher found them. Howard looked at him carefully. "They are definitively yours, Mr. Holloway. Your handwriting on the annotations, your measurements, your signature on the cover sheet. There is no ambiguity." Marcus turned away from both of them and walked to the south wall. He looked at the photograph in the upper left corner. The faded orange and brown photograph from 1988, his engine, his design, his handwriting on a cover sheet that had been sitting in museum storage for 9 years. "The sketches still exist," he said. "They exist," Howard said, "and the Foundation wants to display them, with your name attached, correctly." Marcus kept his eyes on the photograph. He put one hand flat against the wall beside it, and it was the same gesture he'd made at the workbench, hands flat on the surface of things, as if the physical contact helped him think. Maybe it did. He'd never analyzed it. "You said 2 things, Marcus said. He turned around. "What's the second one?" Riley stood up. He walked to where Marcus was standing at the photograph wall and stood beside him, looking at the same wall, at 38 years of names and machines, at the accumulated evidence of a life spent in service of other people's mechanical needs without asking what he'd get back. He stood there for a moment in silence. Then he said, "Gerald Parr." Marcus went still. Your landlord, Riley said. I called him Monday. Before I knew about Friday, I just called him because I wanted to understand the situation here. We talked for about an hour. He paused. Gerald Parr is not a bad man. I know he's not, Marcus said. He didn't want to do this. He told me that in the first 5 minutes. He said he's been your landlord for 21 years, and he's given you more rope than any of his other commercial tenants, and he'd give you more if he could, but the property taxes went up last year, and the chain service center offer was... Riley stopped. He needs the money, Marcus. He needs it the same way you need it. Different scale, but the same fundamental problem. I know, Marcus said quietly. He also said something else. Riley turned to look at him. He said if someone could make him a competing offer that worked for his numbers, he didn't want to give the property to a chain. He said the idea of a chain going into that building. Riley stopped again. He said it would feel wrong. The word offer sat in the space between them. Marcus looked at Riley. He looked at Howard Marsh, who had his folder open and his pen uncapped, and who was watching this conversation with the alert patience of a man who has been waiting for this specific moment. Riley, Marcus said. The foundation has a property acquisition program, Riley said. We've used it 4 times in the past 8 years. Historic motorcycle spaces, shops, garages, one-track facility in Ohio that have cultural significance and are in danger of being lost. We purchase or long-term lease the property, then we operate it in partnership with the original occupant as a heritage site. He met Marcus's eyes directly. Garrett measured this space yesterday. Howard has been on the phone with Gerald Parr twice this week. The foundation wants to make Gerald Parr an offer that meets his numbers, and we want to do it before Friday. The garage was quiet. Marcus heard the road outside, a car passing the distant sound of someone's dog. He heard the buildings settling around him, the way old buildings settle the small creaks and adjustments of the structure that has been standing for decades and intends to keep standing. He heard his own breathing. You want to buy the building, he said. We want to preserve the space, Riley said. There's a difference. We're not buying it from you. It was never yours to sell. We're making sure it doesn't become a chain service center and doesn't close. We're making sure it stays what it is, he paused, which is a working garage run by Marcus Holloway with an expanded purpose. What expanded purpose? Riley looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Tommy's arrangement of tools on the workbench. He looked at the photograph wall. He looked at the 7th motorcycle, the one Marcus had finished at 4:53 in the morning, which was now sitting in the corner of the bay because its owner had not yet come to collect it. There are maybe 200 people left in this country who know what you know, Riley said. People who understand the mechanics of these machines the way you do, who learned it the right way over decades with their hands. That knowledge is not being transferred. The people who have it are getting old, and when they go, it goes with them. He paused. The foundation wants to change that. We've been looking for the right space, the right person, the right story to anchor a training program around. He let that sit for a beat. Your name is going to be on a corrected attribution in the national record. Your design sketches are going to be displayed in an exhibition that opens in 6 months. And we think that story, the real story fully told, is the right story to build a training center around. Marcus said nothing. A place where young mechanics learn from experience, Riley said. From someone who has it, from you. The silence stretched. Marcus walked away from the wall. He walked to the center of the bay and stood there, the same place he'd stood 2 nights ago when Riley had told him about the 11 years, the same patch of oil-stained concrete that he'd stood on for 38 years. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. He thought about James at 12 on the milk crate. He thought about Tommy cleaning the socket set with the focus his grandfather had taught him in Biloxi. He thought about the young mechanic who had come in last month, a kid from the community college, 19 years old, who'd asked if he could watch Marcus work on a Sportster because his instructor had said he should see it done by someone who'd been doing it longer than the instructor had been alive. Marcus had let him stay for 2 hours. The kid had not said much, but he'd watched with the quality of attention that Marcus recognized, the same quality he'd had at 16. The first time he'd understood that engines were not mysterious, but were instead deeply, perfectly logical, and that understanding them was a matter of patience and listening and being willing to be wrong until you were right. He thought about what it would mean to have a place for that kid to come back to. Marcus, Riley's voice was careful, not pressing, just present. Marcus turned around. He looked at Riley and at Howard Marsh with his folder and his uncapped pen, and at the garage around them, and at the wall of photographs at his back. All those names, all those machines, all those years of opening the door for whoever showed up. And he said, "What does Gerald Parr need to hear from me?" Riley exhaled. It was a small sound, barely audible, but Marcus caught it. "He needs to know you're part of this. He said he told me directly that if you're in, he's in. He'll negotiate with the foundation. But he wanted to know it was what you wanted before he moved forward." "Call him," Marcus said. Riley already had his phone out. No. The call with Gerald Parr lasted 23 minutes, and Marcus stood through all of it next to Riley, listening to his landlord of 21 years talk through numbers with Howard Marsh in the kind of specific financial language that Marcus didn't entirely follow, but didn't need to follow because the shape of what was happening was clear enough. At one point, Gerald said Marcus's name, just his first name. The way people say a name when they're directing a statement at a person rather than about them. And Marcus said, "Yes, Gerald, I'm here." And Gerald said, "I'm glad, Marcus. I want you to know that." When the call ended, Riley looked at Marcus with the expression of a man who has done what he said he was going to do. "He's agreed in principle," Howard said, closing his folder. "The formal offer will go to him in writing tomorrow. If he accepts, and I expect he will, we'll have a signed letter of intent before Friday." Marcus nodded. "And there's one more thing," Howard said. He opened the folder again to a specific page. "The attribution matter. We can move on the formal correction with or without your active involvement, but your involvement strengthens the case and speeds the process considerably. I need you to review and sign a declaration that documents your original authorship of the design." "Show me what I'm signing," Marcus said. Howard laid the document on the workbench. Marcus read it, all of it, which took 12 minutes, and which neither Howard nor Riley interrupted or tried to hurry. It was a thorough document, carefully written, and as Marcus read it, he could feel the shape of 11 years of work in its sentences, the depth of research that had gone into establishing what was his, the care with which the foundation had assembled the record. His design sketches, his handwriting, his signature on the cover sheet. 40 years old, sitting in museum storage, waiting for someone to put the right name next to them. He read to the last page. He looked at the signature line. He picked up Howard's pen and signed his name. Howard took the document and put it in the folder. "I'll file this today," he said. "The correction process will take 60 to 90 days once it's in the system. The other party will have an opportunity to respond, but given the documentation," he paused. "The documentation is comprehensive, Mr. Holloway. I don't expect complications." Marcus handed back the pen. "What happens to the man who's been taking credit?" Howard chose his words with the precision of a lawyer. "The attribution is corrected in the official record. His name is removed from the design listing. Whether there are further consequences depends on actions and agreements that are outside the scope of what we're doing today." "He doesn't lose everything," Marcus said, not asking, understanding. "He loses the credit that isn't his," Howard said. "What he built on top of that shows reputation in other areas that stands or falls on its own merits." Which is how it should be. Marcus thought about this. He thought about whether he wanted more than that, whether there was a version of himself that wanted the man to lose more, to feel more of what Marcus hadn't known to feel because he hadn't known what was being taken. He examined himself for that version and found something, a small ember of it, which he looked at honestly and then let be what it was. "That's enough," he said. Howard stood up. "I'll be in touch by tomorrow with the written offer documentation." He shook Marcus's hand. "It's been a privilege." He went to his car. Marcus and Riley stood in the garage alone. The quiet that followed Howard's departure was different from the quiet of the previous night and the night of the storm. Not the quiet of a thing ending or a thing beginning, but the quiet of a thing that has been set in motion and is now doing what set in motion things do, moving forward under their own momentum, no longer requiring the same force that started them. Riley sat back down on his stool. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Marcus pulled up his own stool. He sat on it and looked at his hands. 67-year-old hands, the scarred knuckles, the permanent gray-brown stain of 38 years. He turned them over. "Tired," he said. "Not the bad kind, the other kind." "I know that kind. And something else." He thought about it. "The design sketches, the cover sheet with my signature." He paused. I didn't know anyone had kept those. The collector knew they were important, Riley said, even if he didn't know all the reasons why. I threw away most of my early sketches. I didn't think, Marcus stopped. He hadn't thought about posterity then. He'd been 32 years old and he'd been building something that existed entirely in the present, in the pleasure of the work itself, in the satisfaction of a design that functioned the way he'd imagined it would. Posterity had been James's question to answer. James had been going to inherit everything, the garage, the tools, the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime. And Marcus had never worried about what happened after because James was the future in its entirety. And then James wasn't. He pushed that thought down to where he usually kept it. The training program, he said, how does that work concretely? Riley leaned forward and Marcus recognized the shift in him. The chairman talking now, not just the man who'd been soaking wet in his doorway a week ago. The foundation funds the operational costs for the first 2 years. We work with you to develop the curriculum. You have final say on what's taught and how it's taught because the knowledge is yours and the pedagogy has to come from you or it loses what makes it valuable. We recruit students through community college partnerships and veteran programs and the motorcycle community itself. The first cohort would probably be 8 to 12 people, 6-month program, hands-on, not classroom. How many cohorts a year? 2, potentially 3. That's your call. You set the pace you can sustain. Marcus did the arithmetic in his head. 8 to 12 people per cohort. 2 cohorts a year, 60 to 90 students trained in the first 3 years. He thought about Tommy in Biloxi watching his grandfather in a shop that closed when the grandfather died. He thought about how much would have been different if the shop had stayed open, if there had been someone there to receive what the grandfather knew. The kid from the community college, Marcus said, the one who came in last month. Riley raised an eyebrow. 19 years old, his instructor sent him to watch me work. He's got the right quality of attention. Marcus paused. Can you get me a way to contact your recruiting wall before the first cohort forms? Riley looked at him for a moment. You want to recruit him, Riley said. I want him to have the chance to apply, Marcus said. What he does with it is up to him. Riley reached into his vest pocket and produced a business card. Not his own card, someone else's with a name and email address that Marcus gathered was the foundation's education coordinator. Send her his name and contact information. She'll reach out to him directly. Marcus took the card. Riley, he said. Yeah, the night of the storm. Marcus looked at the bay door at the lot outside where 17 motorcycles had sat in the rain. You said you wanted to see if the story was true. I did. What was the story? Riley was quiet for a moment. He looked at the photograph wall the way he had a habit of doing when he was formulating something. The story was that there was a mechanic in a small Tennessee town who had spent 40 years being the person you went to when there was nowhere else to go, who never turned anyone away, who charged what people could pay and sometimes charged nothing and never made them feel the difference, who had more skill in his hands than most people would ever have in their entire careers, and who used it in service of whoever showed up at his door. He paused. The story was that this man had given everything he had to a community that was slowly forgetting him, and that he had done it without bitterness, without stopping, without asking for anything back. That's a lot to put on one person, Marcus said. It's what people said, Riley said. Dozens of people over years in different contexts. People who had no reason to be coordinating a story. They just kept telling the same one. Marcus sat with that. He thought about all the people whose names were on that wall, all the motorcycles he'd fixed, and the people who'd come back for something else, not just another repair, but for the particular quality of what this place was. What Marcus made it the thing that was harder to name than mechanical skill, but that was what people actually drove 4 hours, for what they actually came back for when they could have gone somewhere closer. He'd never thought about it as a thing he was doing. He'd thought about it as just the job, just what you did. You opened the door and you helped whoever came through it, and you did the work in front of you as well as you could possibly do it, and you tried to see every person and every machine as worthy of your full attention, and you went home at night and you came back in the morning. I have one question, Marcus said. Ask it. The chain service center, the Nashville firm that made Parr the offer. He looked at Riley steadily. Was that real? Riley met his gaze. Gerald Parr told me about it when I called him Monday. Yes, it's real. They've been scouting small-town locations. It's part of a regional expansion. And if you hadn't called him Monday, then the timeline would have been what it was, Riley said. And I don't know how it would have gone. I was trying to move quickly, and I was moving quickly, and then the thing in Knoxville hit, and it slowed everything by 4 days. His expression held something that Marcus recognized as genuine regret. I should have had someone here on day 2. I miscalculated the urgency. You couldn't have known about Friday, Marcus said. No, but I should have established contact sooner. He held Marcus's eyes. I'm telling you that because I want you to know that when I say I have your back going forward, I mean I will not miscalculate the urgency again. That's a specific commitment, not a general sentiment. Marcus nodded. He believed him. He didn't know entirely why he believed him. He'd known this man for 8 days, and 7 of those days had been conducted at a distance. But belief in Marcus's experience was not always the product of time or evidence. Sometimes it was the product of watching someone in a difficult hour and seeing what they did and didn't do. And what Riley had done in this garage on the night of the storm had told Marcus something about his character that 8 months of ordinary acquaintance might not have. There's something I haven't said, Marcus said. Riley waited. The night of the storm, you said you came to see if the story was true. Marcus looked at him. But you were also stranded. You genuinely needed somewhere to go. We did, Riley said. And if I'd kept the door closed, you'd have needed somewhere else. We'd have figured something out. It would have been worse, but we'd have managed. So you didn't need me, Marcus said. Not the way you looked like you did. Riley was quiet for a moment. We needed what you gave us, he said finally. Not just the repairs. We needed someone to open the door when the world was closed. We needed to see it happen. Because, he paused. Because what you're going to teach those kids, what the training program is going to be built around, is not just mechanical knowledge. It's what you do with what you have. It's the decision you made when you had $47 and an eviction notice and a man in your doorway who needed help. Riley's voice had gone quiet. That's the thing we can't teach from a curriculum. But we can build a curriculum around the person who has it. Marcus looked at his hands. He looked at them for a long time. The way you look at something that has been with you your entire adult life and that you've mostly stopped seeing. James would have been 37 this year, he said. His voice was even. He'd practiced evenness about James for a long time, and it mostly worked. He wanted to do this, run the shop, teach, build. He had plans. He paused. He had more plans than he had time. Riley said nothing. He didn't try to respond to this, which was exactly right. Exactly what Marcus needed, just the space to have said it without it being answered or fixed or redirected towards something more comfortable. I think he'd have liked the training program, Marcus said. I think so too, Riley said quietly. I think he'd have given you a hard time about the 7 days of silence, though. Something shifted in Riley's face. Not quite a smile, something more private than a smile, a brief softening around the eyes that came and went. Fair, he said. Marcus stood up from the stool. He walked to the workbench and looked at it, at the tools Tommy had cleaned and arranged at the order that had been given to things he'd let go, disorganized because organization required a vision of a future, and his vision of the future had been narrowing for several years without his having fully registered the narrowing. He picked up a wrench, not to do anything specific with it, just to feel it in his hand. The familiar weight of it, the particular heft of this specific wrench that he'd used since 1987, that had been on the same hook in the same garage for 38 years, and that knew his grip as well as any object he had ever owned. I need to call the community college kid, he said, before someone else gets to him. Riley stood up. His name? Deshaun Miller. He'll be in the automotive program's 2nd year. Tall kid, very quiet, watches everything. Riley wrote it down. One more thing, Marcus said. Name it. The wall. He turned toward the south wall, toward the photographs, toward the decades of names and machines. Whatever this place becomes, the training center, the heritage site, whatever it ends up being called, that wall stays. Riley looked at it. The wall stays, he said, exactly as it is. Marcus turned back to the workbench. He set down the wrench and picked up the next thing that needed his attention. Because there was work to do today and tomorrow and every day after that, and the work did not know about 11 years of searching or eviction, notices or foundation acquisitions or design sketches in museum storage. The work just needed what it always needed: someone to show up, someone to listen, someone with enough patience to find the reason and enough skill to fix what was broken. He was still that person. He had always been that person. He was going to keep being that person. And for the first time in a very long time, he understood that the door he'd been keeping open all these years had not just been for other people. It had been waiting for something to come through it and find him too. The letter of intent arrived on Thursday. Marcus was under a Kawasaki Vulcan when his phone rang the landline, not the cell, and he came out from under the bike with grease on his forearms and picked up the receiver and heard Howard Marsh's voice saying that Gerald Parr had signed, that the foundation's offer had been accepted in principle, that the formal purchase agreement would take 30 to 60 days to finalize, but that Howard had already spoken with the landlord about a bridge arrangement that would keep Marcus operational in the space during the process. What does bridge arrangement mean specifically? Marcus asked. It means Gerald Parr has agreed to suspend the eviction proceedings while the purchase agreement is being prepared, Howard said. You will not be asked to vacate. The chain service center offer has been declined. Marcus stood at the phone with his greasy forearms and said nothing for a moment. Mr. Holloway, I heard you, Marcus said. He stopped. He didn't have a word for what he was. Thank you, Howard. Thank Riley, Howard said, and thank yourself. Gerald Parr told me 3 separate times during our negotiations that the thing that made him say yes was knowing you were part of it. His exact words were that building deserves to stay what it's always been. Howard paused. He's not wrong. Marcus hung up the phone and stood at the workbench and looked at the toolbox, where the eviction notice was still folded and tucked under the 1987 wrench, and he took the notice out and unfolded it and read it one more time and then folded it again along its crease and put it in the pocket of his jacket. Not because he needed to keep it, because it was part of the story, and he had decided somewhere in the past week that he was no longer going to treat the hard parts of the story as things to be hidden in toolboxes. He went back under the Kawasaki. He called Deshaun Miller that same afternoon. The number had come from the community college automotive department. Marcus had called the department chair, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had taught there for 16 years, and who it turned out had been sending students to watch Marcus work for the past 4 years, without Marcus having fully registered the pattern. When he explained why he was calling, there was a silence on her end of the line that had the quality of a person absorbing something they had been hoping for without letting themselves say so. Deshaun specifically, she said. You noticed Deshaun. I noticed his attention, Marcus said. He watches the way people watch when they're actually seeing what's in front of them, not just looking. His grandfather was a mechanic, Patricia said, in Memphis. Deshaun grew up in that shop, and then it closed when he was 14, and he's been chasing that feeling ever since. He doesn't say it that way. He says he's interested in the trade. She paused. But that's what it is. He's chasing that feeling. Marcus thought about Tommy and Biloxi. He thought about himself at 16, the first time he understood what an engine was actually doing. Can you give him my number and ask him to call me? I can do better than that, Patricia said. He's here right now. He comes in on Thursday afternoons to use the shop equipment. Can I put him on, A pause, some movement, and then a young man's voice, slightly cautious. Mr. Holloway. Deshaun. Marcus settled onto his stool. You remember coming to my garage last month? Yes, sir. I watched you work on a Sportster. What do you remember about it? A beat of silence, not the silence of someone who doesn't know the answer, but of someone deciding how much of the answer to give. The fuel delivery issue you found wasn't where the symptom was, Deshaun said carefully. The bike was running rough at idle, and most people would have started with the carb, but you went to the fuel petcock first because of the way the roughness changed under load. You said something about listening to where the problem was not where it showed up. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I said that. You probably say it a lot, but I wrote it down. Marcus looked at the wall of photographs. He thought about 38 years of people sitting on milk crates and watching and writing things down, or not writing them down, and either carrying it forward or letting it go. I want to tell you about something, he said. Something that's happening with this garage. And I want to ask you a question when I'm done, and I want you to answer it honestly, not the way you think I want it answered. All right, Deshaun said. Marcus told him. Not all of it, not the 11 years or the design sketches or the full weight of everything that had moved in the past week, but enough. The training program, the cohort structure, the 6 months, the hands-on curriculum. He talked for maybe 5 minutes without interruption, and Deshaun listened the way he watched with that quality of total present attention that Marcus had noticed the first time and that he recognized now as a thing worth protecting. When Marcus finished, Deshaun said, "What's the question? Is this something you want?" Marcus said, "Or something you think you should want?" Silence, a real silence, the kind that means a person is actually checking, not performing consideration. "It's something I've been looking for," Deshaun said finally. "I didn't know it existed, but it's what I've been looking for." A pause. "Is that different from wanting it?" "No," Marcus said. "That's exactly what wanting it looks like." He gave Deshaun the education coordinator's contact information and told him to reach out this week, not next week, and Deshaun said, "Yes, sir," with a particular quality of "yes, sir" that meant he understood the difference between this week and next week. Marcus hung up and sat on his stool for a moment, with the phone still warm in his hand, and thought about the thing Patricia Osei had said. He's chasing that feeling, the feeling of a shop, the feeling of a place where things made sense and work had weight, and the results of your attention were real and visible and mattered. He knew exactly what that felt like. He'd been chasing it himself in a way for 15 years, not a different shop. This shop, this specific space, just a version of it that was safe and funded and had a future instead of a Friday deadline. He'd been fixing what was in front of him and hoping that was enough to hold the thing together, and it had almost worked, and then it hadn't, and now something he couldn't have engineered for himself had come in from a rainstorm and changed the equation entirely. He got back under the Kawasaki. The first person to show up on Saturday who was not there for a repair was a woman named Claudette. She was in her early 40s, drove a late model pickup, and walked into the garage with the specific energy of someone who has been given information that they are not sure is true and have come to verify it in person. She stopped just inside the bay door and looked around and then looked at Marcus. "Are you the one they're calling the mechanic who helped the Hells Angels?" Marcus straightened up from the bike he was working on. "I helped some riders who needed help. I don't know what they're calling it." "My cousin was there," she said. "He called me 3 days after it happened. He talked about you for 45 minutes. She paused. "My cousin does not talk about anything for 45 minutes. "Who's your cousin?" "Junior." Marcus thought about Junior asleep against the south wall, about Junior working on the doorframe in the early morning, about Junior's 12 years as a contractor, and the way he'd addressed the building's problems with the same quiet competence that Tommy had applied to the tools. "Your cousin does good work," Marcus said. Claudette looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the photograph wall. Then she looked back at Marcus. "He said you had a wall of every person you would ever help," she said. "Not every person, most of them." She walked to the wall and stood in front of it and read names, moving her eyes across the photographs, the way a person reads something they didn't expect to find moving and is discovering that they are moved by it anyway. She stood there for a long time. "My father's name might be on this wall," she said. Marcus walked up beside her. "What was his name?" "Leonard Beaumont. He had a Harley shovelhead. He used to bring it in here, I think. I was young. I remember him talking about a shop in Redwood Creek." Marcus looked at the wall. He found it in the middle section, mid-90s era, a photograph of a shovelhead that had needed significant framework, and beneath it, in his handwriting, Leonard Beaumont, 1994. He pointed to it. Claudette put her hand over her mouth. She stood like that for a moment, and Marcus didn't say anything. Just stood beside her and gave her the space that the moment required. He'd had other moments like this at the wall, people finding their parents, their grandparents' old versions of themselves. It happened more than you'd expect. People carry their father's stories without always knowing they're carrying them. "He died in 2008, she said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was effortful. "I didn't know he came here until Junior told me." "He came here 3 or 4 times, Marcus said. "Mostly small stuff. The shovelhead needed framework that one time, which was a bigger job, but he was easy to work with. Paid what was fair and didn't ask for more than what was right." He paused. He was a man who took care of his things. Claudette lowered her hand from her mouth and looked at the photograph of her father's motorcycle. "He was," she said softly. She stayed for 2 hours. She helped with small things, handing Marcus tools, holding parts in position, because she'd been raised around her father's mechanical work and her hands knew how to be useful in a shop. She told him about her father, who had driven trucks for 30 years and had kept that shovel head running through 3 decades of hard Tennessee winters, and had loved the machine the way some men love the things that ask them to learn and don't apologize for being difficult. Marcus told her what he remembered about the framework, which was more than she expected, because he remembered most jobs that had been technically interesting, and the shovelhead's frame issue had required a solution that he'd had to think through carefully. "Why do you remember the details?" she asked. "After this many years, after this many bikes." "Because they were worth remembering," Marcus said simply. "Each one was someone's specific problem with their specific machine. I treated them that way." She left in the early afternoon, and Marcus wouldn't know until later that she was a reporter for the Knoxville Sentinel, and that the story she was going to write would be the first crack in a wall of obscurity that had been building around Marcus Holloway for 15 years. The article appeared online on Monday morning. Marcus didn't have internet at the garage. He found out about the article because Patricia O.C. called him at 9 in the morning to say that her phone had been ringing since 7:30 and that 3 other outlets had already picked up the piece and were asking for contact information. He found out what the article said because Riley called at 9:15 and read him the first 3 paragraphs over the phone, which was enough to give him the shape of it Claudette had written about the night of the storm, about the photograph wall, about her father's motorcycle, about what it meant to be in a space where people had been genuinely cared for over 4 decades. She had not called Marcus for a quote before publishing it. He didn't know how he felt about that. It wasn't entirely comfortable, but the discomfort wasn't enough to make him wish she hadn't written it, because the thing she'd written was true, which was the only standard Marcus applied to most things. "It's being shared widely," Riley said. "The motorcycle community specifically, it's spreading fast in those networks." "What does that mean for the training program?" Marcus asked. Because that was the relevant question. The attention itself meant nothing to him. What it could do was the question. "It means the Foundation's education coordinator has already received 12 inquiries from people asking about the first cohort," Riley said. "By the end of the week, that number is going to be significantly higher." He paused. "It also means that the man who has been taking credit for your engine design has seen it. His attorney called Howard this morning." Marcus went still. "Saying what?" "Saying his client would like to discuss a resolution before the formal correction process concludes." Riley's tone was measured, giving Marcus the information without the editorial weight that Marcus could feel Riley restraining. "Howard says that's a normal response when someone knows the documentation doesn't favor them. It means he's not going to fight it. He's going to let the record be corrected without a contest. That's what Howard expects." A pause. "How do you feel about that?" Marcus thought about it honestly. He'd expected more resistance, had been braced for a fight for legal language and delays in the grinding process of proving something that should never have needed proving. The fact that it wasn't going to go that way produced something unexpected, not quite relief and not quite disappointment, but a complicated middle feeling, as if the scale of the wrong required a proportionate battle to properly register it. And the absence of the battle left something unresolved. "I feel like it's right," Marcus said, "even if it doesn't feel like enough." "That's honest," Riley said. "I told you I'd be honest." "You did." Another pause. "Marcus, there's going to be more attention coming. The article is the beginning of it, not the whole thing. The exhibition, when it opens in 6 months, the story will get significantly larger. I want to make sure you're prepared for that." What does prepared mean? It means knowing that people are going to want to talk to you and having some say over how that happens. Howard can advise you on that. The Foundation has a communications person who helps our heritage figures. That's not a word I love, but it's the word that fits manage the attention in a way that serves what they actually care about, rather than what the attention wants to focus on. Marcus thought about Claudette and her father's photograph and the 2 hours she'd spent handing him tools. The attention she'd brought hadn't felt like something to be managed. It had felt like a natural consequence of a thing that had happened and that had mattered. "I don't want to be managed," he said. "Not managed, assisted." Riley's voice was careful. "There's a difference. Managed means someone else decides what the story is. Assisted means you keep deciding what the story is and someone helps you say it clearly." Marcus considered this. "I'll talk to the communications person," he said. "I'm not promising more than that." That's all I'm asking. Mamano. The trucks arrived on Wednesday. Marcus was opening the garage at 7:30 when the first one pulled in, and then the second, and he stood in the bay door and watched while the lot filled with vehicles he didn't recognize. And then a door opened and Garrett stepped out. Danny Garrett, who had come with his measuring tape and his notebook 8 days ago. And behind Garrett came Junior, and behind Junior came three other men Marcus didn't know, and then one more vehicle, and out of it came Tommy, with a fresh bandage on his forearm that meant he'd seen a doctor, which gave Marcus a specific satisfaction. "What is this?" Marcus said. Garrett walked up to him with a clipboard. "Roof electrical panel, 2 sections of wall framing exterior, weather sealing," he said. "Materials are in the trucks. Estimate is 4 days, maybe 3.5 if the weather holds, and Junior stops wanting to do everything twice." "I do it twice because you do it wrong the first time," Junior said from somewhere behind Garrett. "We can have this argument while we work," Garrett said, not to Marcus, but to the air in the general direction of Junior. He looked back at Marcus. "The foundation is covering materials and the guys are volunteering labor. Riley asked us to get it done before the formal papers are signed. He didn't want you to spend another month looking at that roof." Marcus looked at the trucks. He looked at the men. He looked at Tommy, who had found Marcus's eye and given him the same single nod he'd given at breakfast on the morning after the storm, the nod that meant something was happening, and Tommy was committed to it. "The garage is yours," Marcus said. "Tell me what stays out of your way." "You," Garrett said. "Go work. We'll build around you." Marcus almost laughed. He hadn't laughed in a while, and the impulse surprised him. Not a social laugh, not a polite laugh, but the real kind, the kind that comes when reality does something that exceeds what you'd thought to hope for. He didn't let it fully out. He swallowed it down and turned it into a sound that was somewhere between acknowledgement and amusement, and went back into the garage and picked up the job he'd been about to start. For the next 4 days, Marcus worked on motorcycles while 4 men rebuilt the space around him. The sounds of construction became the background of his days, the particular percussion of hammer and drill and the back and forth of men who are working together on something physical and technical, and who communicate partly in words and partly in the shared language of the work itself. Junior's voice carried above the others, precise and directive, correcting and instructing. And Garrett's responses were measured and dry, and the two of them together produced a running negotiation that was clearly an established pattern between people who had been doing this together for years. Tommy worked quieter than either of them. Marcus could hear him knew by sound which part of the job he was on, and what he heard was someone who had identified the task in front of him and was doing it with everything he had, which Marcus recognized and respected and said nothing about, because the right response to that kind of work ethic was to match it, not to comment on it. On the second day in the afternoon, Tommy came and stood beside Marcus while Marcus was rebuilding a carburetor. "Can I ask you something technical?" Tommy said. "Go ahead." "The fuel delivery fix you did on the Storm night, the modified pickup. Can you walk me through the reasoning on that?" Marcus set down the carburetor and looked at Tommy. The young man's forearm was properly bandaged. He'd lost the slightly shaken quality around his eyes that he'd had on the night itself, and he was looking at Marcus with the focused attention that was apparently his default mode when something interested him genuinely. Marcus walked him through it. All of it, the diagnosis logic, the decision to modify, rather than wait for a correct part, the specific modification, and why it would hold the failure modes and what to watch for. He talked for 20 minutes, and Tommy listened and asked 3 questions, all of them exactly the right questions. The questions of someone who is not just learning the specific answer, but trying to understand the reasoning structure behind it so they can apply it to the next problem. When Marcus finished, Tommy nodded slowly. "You think in systems," he said, "not in components." "Explain that," Marcus said, because he wanted to know what Tommy meant, not because he was testing him. "Most people diagnose by component," Tommy said. "Something's wrong, check this component, then this one, work down a list. You diagnose by behavior. You watch what the system is doing and work backward to what would produce that behavior. It's faster and it finds things the component check misses." Marcus looked at him. "That's accurate," Marcus said. "Your grandfather teach you that?" Tommy asked. "Myself," Marcus said. "I made enough mistakes early on that I had to figure out a better method." He picked up the carburetor again. "The mistakes are how you learn the method. You can't skip them." Tommy absorbed this. "That should be in the curriculum," he said. "What should the mistakes? Teaching the reasoning by teaching what goes wrong when you reason badly." He looked at Marcus. not just how to do it right. Why certain ways of thinking lead you wrong. Marcus held the carburetor and thought about this. It was a good idea. It was, in fact, a better pedagogical idea than most of the things he'd been imagining for the curriculum, which had tended to focus on knowledge transfer rather than reasoning transfer. You could teach someone to do a procedure correctly. Teaching them to think through a problem they'd never encountered was a different and harder thing. Write that down, Marcus said. Tommy produced a small notebook from his pocket, the same kind of notebook Riley had used on the night of the storm, and Marcus noted this with the particular attention he gave to things that turned out to be patterns and wrote it down. You're going to be one of the advisors on this curriculum, aren't you? Marcus said. Not a question. Tommy looked up. Riley asked if I'd be willing to help, he said carefully. Good, Marcus said. I need people who think about the right things. He went back to the carburetor. Don't tell Riley I said that. He'll think he did something right. Tommy made a sound that might have been a laugh, suppressed with significant effort. On the fourth day of the construction work, Walt came. He came alone, no Diana, which told Marcus that this was a visit Walt had decided on independently on his own terms. He pulled into the lot in a car that was older than his years of success might have suggested, and walked into the garage with the measured steadiness of a man who had recovered fully and was demonstrating it. And he shook Marcus's hand and looked around at the reconstruction happening in the upper sections of the space and said nothing for a moment. Looks better already, Walt said. Junior doesn't do things halfway, Marcus said. No, he doesn't. Walt looked at Garrett and Junior working on the upper wall framing, at Tommy on the electrical panel, housing at the general organized purposefulness of the space. Good people, he said. Yours, Marcus said. Walt turned and looked at him directly. Ours, he said. That's what I came to say, actually. He moved toward the workbench and sat on the stool there, the same stool he'd been helped to on the night of the storm, and Marcus thought that Walt probably knew that and had chosen it deliberately. I've been on the board of the Heritage Foundation for 11 years. I've seen a lot of projects come through. Acquisitions, restorations, training programs, exhibitions. Some of them worked well. Some of them work the way things work when the right people are involved. But the soul of the thing isn't quite there. He paused. This one has the soul. Because of the storm, Marcus said. Because of you, Walt said. The storm was logistics. You were the reason. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at Marcus. I want you to know something about that night. What you did for me, specifically. Marcus said nothing, just waited. I've been dealing with a heart issue, Walt said. Not serious enough to stop writing, not minor enough to ignore. Diana worries every time we go out. That night, he stopped. The hypothermia was real, and it wasn't the only thing going on. I was in worse shape than I let anyone know, including Diana. When you sat with me and made me talk about the Blue Ridge and kept me present. He stopped again. His voice had done something it apparently did when he talked about this. He waited for it to settle. You didn't know you were doing more than keeping an old man warm, he said. But you were. Marcus looked at him. He looked at this man who had been on a foundation board for 11 years and who sat on the Heritage Board and who had restored bikes for the Smithsonian and who was telling him in the plain language that men of a certain age and experience use when they've decided plain language is the only one worth speaking, that a conversation about the Blue Ridge in a cold office in the middle of a Tennessee rainstorm had mattered more than Marcus had known. I'm glad you're here, Marcus said. Walt nodded once. So am I. He straightened on the stool. Now, the foundation board meets in 3 weeks. I'd like you to come to the board meeting, not to present anything, not to perform, to sit in the room and hear how the foundation works, who makes decisions, what the priorities are. Because you're going to be in a relationship with this organization for a long time, and you should understand what it is before you're deep in it. He paused. And because I'd like the board to meet the man before they start making decisions about the program that's going to carry his name. The program that's going to carry his name. Marcus hadn't heard it put that way before. The training program, yes. The heritage designation, yes. But carrying his name, Jimmy's, had been the thing that was supposed to carry Marcus's name forward. The child who was the future in its simplest form. And James was gone, and Marcus had stopped thinking about what carried his name forward, because thinking about it required thinking about James, and then the thinking about James would take over the whole space and leave room for nothing else. But a program, a place where young mechanics learn to think in systems and to listen for what the problem needed and to be the person who opened the door when the world was closed. A place that would be here after Marcus was gone, doing what Marcus had done, shaped by what Marcus knew. That was a form of forward. "I'll come to the board meeting," Marcus said. Walt stood up. He moved toward the door and then stopped. "One more thing," he said. "Diana wants to know if you'd come to dinner. Sunday. Our house in Knoxville. Nothing formal. She's not a formal woman, but she makes a proper meal on Sundays, and she says the least she can do is feed the man who kept her husband alive in a rainstorm." "Walt," Marcus said, "I made you drink hot water and talk about roads you've ridden." "I know what you did," Walt said. "Diana knows what you did. Come to dinner." Marcus looked at him for a moment. He thought about the Sunday dinners he'd eaten alone in the house on Crestview for 14 years, the specific quality of that particular silence. He thought about Diana at the camp stove with her 20 portions, because Riley always undercounts the flat affection of a woman who has been taking care of the people around her for so long that she does it without announcing it. "What time?" Marcus said. 6 o'clock. I'll text you the address." He paused. You'll need to charge your phone." No," Marcus said. Walt almost smiled. He walked out to his car and Marcus watched him go, and then turned back to the garage where the construction sounds had continued through the entire conversation, steady and purposeful, the sounds of a building being made better than it was. The moment that broke Marcus open happened on Friday afternoon, and he hadn't seen it coming. He was alone in the garage. Garrett and his crew had wrapped up their work that morning, 4 days as promised, the roof properly done and the electrical panel replaced and the wall framing solid and the exterior sealed, and Junior having done everything twice because that was how Junior worked. And Marcus had shaken each man's hand when they left with the specific gravity of someone who understood that no handshake is ever just a handshake. The garage was quiet now, and cleaner and more solid than it had been in years, and Marcus was at the workbench going through the tool arrangement that Tommy had established, familiarizing himself fully with the new system so that he could work within it naturally. He heard a car in the lot, not a motorcycle, a car ordinary, and he didn't give it much attention until the footsteps came to the bay door and stopped, and he looked up. The man in the doorway was around 60, slight build, wearing a jacket that had seen a lot of weather, holding a helmet under his arm that was old enough to have been retired years ago, but that he apparently hadn't retired. He looked at Marcus with an expression that Marcus couldn't immediately read. "Marcus Holloway," he said. "That's me. My name is Gerald." He paused. "Gerald Beaumont, Claudette's uncle, Leonard's brother." Marcus set down the tool in his hand. Gerald Beaumont came into the garage, slowly looking around with the look of a man who is entering a space that exists in his memories and is comparing the memory to the present. He stopped in the middle of the bay. He looked at the photograph wall. "She told me about the picture," he said. "My niece, she said she found Leonard's motorcycle on the wall." His voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with age. "I wasn't sure if I wanted to come. It took me a few days to decide." "I'm glad you came," Marcus said. Gerald looked at him. He never talked about this place by name. He just said there was a man in Redwood Creek who could fix anything and who treated you right when you came in. He said that twice that I can remember, once when I was having trouble with my own bike, and he told me where to go, and once he stopped. Once near the end, when he was sick, he was talking about the people he'd dealt with right in his life, and he mentioned the shop in Redwood Creek. He paused. "He didn't mention your name. He just said the man at the shop." Marcus stood at the workbench and listened to this. "He died in 2008, Gerald said. Dies pancreatic, fast." He said it the way people say the method and the speed of a loss when the words have been said enough times that they've worn smooth like stones in a river. "I've been riding since I was 19 years old. Leonard's the one who taught me. He got me my first bike and taught me how to listen to it and how to take care of it." He looked at the photograph wall again. "I ride because of him. Every mile I've put on a motorcycle in 40 years, he's in it somewhere." Marcus walked to the wall. He found the photograph, Leonard Beaumont, 1994, the shovelhead with the framework, and he took it down carefully. The tack that had held it for 30 years was rusted almost to nothing and came out of the wall with the photograph still attached, and he turned it over. On the back, in his handwriting, from 1994, L. Beaumont. Shovelhead frame, significant rust at lower junction, welded and braced. Good machine, needs regular attention. Owner takes care of it. He handed the photograph to Gerald. Gerald looked at it. He looked at the front, the motorcycle, the handwriting of Marcus's notation beneath it, and then turned it over and read the back, and something happened in his face that went through several stages, none of which Marcus tried to name. Owner takes care of it, Gerald said. He did, Marcus said. Gerald held the photograph with both hands for a long moment. He looked up at the wall, at all of it, at 300 plus names and machines, and years at the accumulated evidence of one man's decision to remember. His jaw worked. Can I? He stopped. Started again. Can I have this? It's yours, Marcus said. It's always been yours. Gerald Beaumont stood in the middle of the garage and held his brother's photograph and cried. He didn't try to stop it, and he didn't apologize for it, and Marcus didn't move toward him or away from him, just stood nearby in the way you stand near someone, when what they need is not intervention, but presence. When the geography of the moment requires another person to be in the room, but doesn't require that person to do anything except be there and not flinch. After a while, Gerald's breathing steadied. He looked at Marcus. My niece says something's happening here, he said. Something new. Yes, Marcus said, a training program. Gerald wiped his face with the back of his hand, unselfconsciously the way men do when they have accepted that emotion is happening and resistance is neither possible nor useful. For young mechanics. That's right. Leonard would have... He stopped, collected himself again. He believed in learning things right. He always said you couldn't fake the knowledge that it either came from someone who had it or it didn't come at all. He looked at Marcus steadily. He was right to trust this place. I hope I earned it, Marcus said. You earned it, Gerald said. The fact that my brother talked about this place near the end, when a person is dying and they're talking about the things they dealt with, right? Those things earned it. He held out his hand. Marcus shook it. My niece also said you haven't taken a photograph of yourself for this wall in 38 years. Marcus looked at the wall. Gerald was right. Every photograph was a machine, not a person. Marcus was present in the wall in every possible way except literally. I don't, he started. She thinks you should, Gerald said. He produced his phone. She specifically asked me to ask you. He looked at Marcus with the expression of a man delivering a message whose logic he personally agrees with. She said, tell him Wall should have the mechanic too. Marcus looked at the wall. He looked at 38 years of names that weren't his own, at 300 plus machines that had passed through his hands, at the full accumulated evidence of a life in service of other people's things and other people's needs, and he thought about Claudette finding her father there, and Gerald holding the photograph with both hands, and Walt in the chair talking about the Blue Ridge, and Deshawn writing things down in a notebook. And Tommy with his grandfather's knowledge of how to clean a socket set. He thought about James on the milk crate. All right, he said. He stood against the south wall to the left of the photographs, and Gerald Beaumont took a photograph of Marcus Holloway with his phone's 67-years-old jacket on hands at his sides, standing in his garage with 38 years of names at his back. Gerald showed him the image. Marcus looked at it for a moment. He looked at the face of a man he'd spent 15 years trying to keep functional and present, without asking what else he might be at the hands that had been described as golden by people who'd heard the story, and as simply his by Marcus himself at the garage wall visible behind him in the photograph, all those names spreading away from him in every direction. He looked like a man who was supposed to be here. Send that to Claudette, Marcus said. Gerald did. Her response came back in less than a minute. A single line that Gerald read aloud to Marcus, standing in the bay of the garage that was no longer in danger of closing in the space that was going to become something larger than it had been, and also exactly what it had always been. She wrote, print it and put it on the wall where it belongs. Marcus took the photograph from Gerald's phone to the printer in the back office, an ancient machine barely functional that he'd been nursing along for 3 years, and he printed the photograph and he came back out, and he found a tack in the shallow drawer under the workbench, and he walked to the south wall, and he found the space that had always been there to the left of everything, the space where a person stands when they are the beginning of the story rather than its subject, and he pressed the tack through the photograph and into the wall. Marcus Holloway. The wall said it now, not in handwriting, in the photograph itself, in the fact of his presence in his own place among all the people and machines he'd cared for finally visible in the record he'd been keeping for 38 years. He stepped back. He looked at it. Gerald Beaumont stood beside him, and they both looked at it, and the garage held the sound of their silence and the sound of the road outside and the sound of the building settling into its repaired and reinforced frame. And somewhere under all of that, below the threshold of what could be heard, the sound of a story finding its shape. The Sunday dinner at Walt and Diana's house in Knoxville was the first time Marcus had sat at someone else's table in 14 years. He drove the 40 minutes from Redwood Creek and with the window down, because the October evening was the kind of cool that felt earned after a long, hot summer, and he wore the same jacket he wore every day because it was the only jacket he owned that was presentable, and he brought a bottle of wine that Patricia Osei had told him was appropriate for a Sunday dinner when you didn't know what was being served and didn't want to guess wrong. He found the address, parked on the street, walked to the door and stood there for a moment before knocking with the particular self-consciousness of a man who has been alone so long that ordinary social situations have acquired a mild strangeness. Diana opened the door before he could knock. "I heard your truck," she said. "It needs a muffler." "I know," Marcus said. "It's on the list." "Come in." She took the wine from him without ceremony and walked toward the kitchen, and Marcus followed her into a house that smelled like a real meal. Something with rosemary and garlic. Something long cooked, the smell of a kitchen that had been working all day. "Walt's in the back," she said. "He's been pretending to read for the last hour. He doesn't settle well when he's waiting for something." Marcus found Walt in a chair near the window, with a book open on his knee at a page he had clearly not been reading. He looked up when Marcus came in, and the expression on his face was the particular one that men of a certain age produce when they're pleased about something and trying not to make too much of it. He stood up and shook Marcus's hand, and they sat and talked for 40 minutes before Diana called them to the table. And the conversation moved through the board meeting agenda and the foundation's current projects and the training program timeline. But underneath the practical content, Marcus could feel the other thing, the thing that was harder to put words around, the specific comfort of being in a room with people who knew the full story and weren't trying to manage or diminish or inflate it, who were just sitting with him in the truth of it. At the table, Diana served a roasted chicken that had clearly been thought about in advance, and there were sweet potatoes and green beans and cornbread, and the wine turned out to be exactly right, and Marcus ate more than he'd eaten at a single sitting in longer than he could accurately remember. "You're thin," Diana said, watching him eat. "I've been eating alone," Marcus said. "I know," she said. "That's why I made enough for tomorrow, too. You're taking food home." Marcus looked at her. She looked back at him with the flat certainty of a woman who has decided something and is not presenting it as negotiable. "All right," he said. Walt watched this exchange with the expression of a man who has spent decades in the company of someone who is almost always right and has made his peace with it. After dinner, after the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured, Walt set something on the table between them. A folder thin with the Foundation's letterhead on the cover. He didn't open it immediately. He put his hand flat on top of it the way Marcus put his hand flat on the workbench when he was thinking. "The board met informally this week," Walt said. Before the official meeting in 3 weeks, I called an informal session because something came up that I wanted to move on quickly." He looked at Marcus steadily. "The Heritage Foundation has a fellowship designation. We give it to individuals whose contribution to American motorcycle culture we consider foundational. There have been 9 recipients in the Foundation's history. The designation includes a lifetime stipend, not large, but meaningful and formal recognition in the permanent record." Marcus held his coffee mug and looked at Walt. "The board voted unanimously to offer the fellowship to you," Walt said. "All 11 members. That has happened once before in 9 recipients." The kitchen was very quiet. Diana had her hands around her own coffee mug and was looking at the table, not at Marcus, giving him the space to receive this without an audience. Marcus put his coffee mug down. "Walt," he said. "You don't have to decide tonight," Walt said. "The folder has the details. Read it. Take the time you need." He paused. "But I want to tell you something about the vote. When I presented your name, I told the board about the night of the storm, about what you did, how you did it, and why. And then I told them about the attribution situation, about the design, about 11 years, about the fact that you'd had no idea and had kept working anyway." He looked at Marcus with a directness that had nothing performed in it. "One of our board members, a woman who has been on this board for 7 years and who does not cry at board meetings, cried at the board meeting. She said the thing she kept thinking about was the wall, the names, the fact that you'd remembered everyone." Marcus looked at his hands on the table. She said, Walt's voice did the thing it did when the emotion was close to the surface. He let it do it, didn't fight it. She said that a man who spends 40 years making sure that other people know they were remembered deserves to know that he was remembered too. The silence held for a long moment. James, Marcus said. His voice came out rough. He hadn't planned to say the name. It just came the way it came in the dream, the way it came when the truth arrived ahead of his ability to manage it. He stopped. He breathed. He would have been so angry about the attribution thing. He would have been angry in a way I couldn't let myself be because he stopped again. He had less patience for injustice than I did. He thought things should be right the way young people think things should be right, completely and immediately, and he would have fought for it in a way that he put his hand flat on the table. I'm glad someone fought for it. You fought for it, Walt said quietly, by being here, by keeping the work honest and the door open for 38 years. That was the fight. Riley just found the paperwork. Marcus looked at him, then he opened the folder. He read it that night when he got home, sitting at his kitchen table in the house on Crestview, with Diana's food containers stacked in his refrigerator and the wine still faintly present in his thinking. The fellowship documentation was thorough. The stipend amount, which was not large, but which was, as Walt had said, meaningful enough to cover the gap between what the garage brought in and what Marcus needed to maintain the life he had. The formal recognition in the permanent record, his name corrected and placed next to his work. His photograph, Gerald's photograph, the one that was now on the south wall, submitted to the Foundation's archives. And one more thing. At the back of the folder, a single page with the Foundation's official seal at the top and beneath it a proposal. The training program, when it launched, would carry an official name. The board had proposed it. They were asking Marcus's approval before they finalized anything. The James Holloway School of Mechanical Arts. Marcus sat at his kitchen table and read that line 6 times. He sat there for a while after that. He didn't move. He didn't do anything. He let the feeling do what it needed to do, which was large and complicated and had several components that arrived in stages. The grief first, the wave of it. James at 31, and all the years after that, Marcus had carried the absence like a secondary skeleton, the structural weight of a loss that never became lighter, but that you learned to distribute differently. And then beneath the grief, something else. Something that the grief had been sitting on top of for 15 years, keeping down with its weight. And that was now, with the weight shifted even slightly, able to surface. Pride. Not in himself, in James. In the fact that James Marcus Holloway, who had asked why, does that one do that at 12 years old, and who had grown into a man whose father had been planning to hand him an entire life, was going to have his name on a building where young people learn to listen to broken things and find the reason. That was a form of James being here. Being not the form Marcus would have chosen, not the form either of them would have chosen, but a real form, a lasting form, a form that would outlast both of them in the way that things outlast the people who made them when those things are built on what was true. Marcus called Riley at 11:30 at night, which was later than he would normally call anyone, and Riley answered on the second ring. You read the folder, Riley said. I read the folder, Marcus said. And the name, Marcus said. The school. Yes. Was that you? A pause. It was Walt's idea, Riley said. He brought it to the board. I seconded it immediately. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I need you to know something, he said. Tell me. I closed down for a long time after James died, Marcus said. Not the garage, I kept the garage open. But something in me. Something about the future, about what things were for. I stopped being able to see past the present tense. Everything was just the work in front of me. The bike, the next thing. He paused. The night you came to my door, all 17 of you, I was holding an eviction notice. I had $47, and I opened the door anyway, not because I was brave or because I had some vision about what it meant. I opened it because it was the thing in front of me, and it needed doing. Another pause. I need you to know that. I know it, Riley said. That's exactly what I needed to know when I came. Because a man who does the right thing from some grand principle is different from a man who does it because it's the next thing, Marcus said. Exactly. Which one is more useful to you? The second one, Riley said without hesitation. Every time. Grand principles are easy. Showing up when you have $47 and an eviction notice, that's the real thing. Marcus sat at his kitchen table in the silence of the house on Crestview and thought about 38 years of the real thing. I'm going to accept the fellowship, he said, and I'm going to accept the name for the school. Good, Riley said. And then more quietly, he'd have been extraordinary, Marcus, from everything you've told me about him. He would have, Marcus said. He really would have. He said good night and hung up and sat at the table for a while longer, and then he went to bed, and he slept well. The 60 days that followed moved the way significant periods of life move. When you're inside them, not quickly or slowly, but with a particular density each day, containing more than days usually contain the ordinary texture of existence, thickened by the presence of things that matter. The purchase agreement was signed on a Thursday morning in Howard Marsh's office in Nashville, with Marcus and Riley and Walt present, and Gerald Parr sitting across the table with the expression of a man releasing something he'd been holding longer than was comfortable. When the last signature was on the last page, Gerald looked at Marcus across the table. I should have found another way earlier, Gerald said. I want you to know I know that. You did the best you could with what you had, Marcus said. So did I. We're here now. Gerald nodded. He reached across the table and shook Marcus's hand, and it lasted the same beat longer than a standard handshake, the same kind Walt had given him, the kind that means what it means. The first cohort applications came through December. The Foundation's education coordinator, a woman named Sandra Reyes, who called Marcus every Tuesday morning at 9 sharp, and had the organized efficiency of someone who had built programs from scratch before and knew where the complications lived, reported that they had received 87 applications for the first cohort of 12. She sent Marcus all 87 and asked him to read them and mark the ones that felt right. And he read them all over the course of 2 weeks, which was longer than Sandra had expected, and which she accepted without comment when he explained that he wanted to read each application with the attention it deserved. He marked 22. Sandra narrowed them to 15 through a secondary review process and then sat with Marcus on a Tuesday morning in January and went through the 15 together. They chose 12. Deshaun Miller was on the list. Marcus had marked his application first before reading any others, not because of favoritism, but because Deshaun had written about his grandfather in a way that told Marcus he understood what knowledge was for and where it came from and what you owed to the person who gave it to you. The youngest cohort member was 22. The oldest was 51, a veteran named Clarence who had been working on his own bikes for 20 years and wanted the formal knowledge to match the practical experience. Sandra had flagged Clarence's application with a note saying she wasn't sure about the age gap, and Marcus had written back a single sentence. That's exactly the kind of person this program needs. Tommy was not in the cohort. He was on the curriculum advisory committee, which was different and which suited him better. His mind was a builder's mind, interested in the architecture of how learning worked, and Marcus had come to understand that this was where Tommy's particular quality of attention was most valuable, not in being taught but in shaping the structure of the teaching. The committee met twice before the program launched in the back of the garage around a table that Junior had built from reclaimed wood. Junior had apparently decided at some point that Marcus needed a proper table and had built one without being asked, which Marcus had discovered one morning when he came in and found it there with a note that said for the meetings. The committee members sat around it and argued productively about sequencing and methodology and what a 6-month program could realistically accomplish. And Marcus listened more than he talked and spoke when he had something specific to say, which was how he'd always operated and which turned out to work well in this context. The one thing he insisted on, the thing he put on the table in the first meeting and didn't move off of, was this: every student in every cohort would spend the first week not touching a single machine. The first week was listening, walking through the garage, handling tools without using them, being asked to describe what they heard and what they thought they heard and what the difference was between those two things. It was the week that Marcus had never had, the formal version of what he'd learned informally at 16, when he first understood that patience was a mechanical skill as much as a human one. The committee debated this. Tommy was quiet through the debate and then said the mistakes are how you learn the method. You can't skip them. He said it to the room, not to Marcus, and the room understood what he meant, and the debate resolved. The first week stayed. The night before the first cohort arrived, Marcus sat in the empty garage for a long time. It was February, cold enough that he had the space heaters running, and the garage was warm in the way it had been warm on the night of the storm, that particular enclosed warmth that a space produces when it's working against the cold outside and winning. He sat on his stool at the workbench with his hands flat on the surface and looked at his garage. The repairs were solid. The roof no longer sang in the wind with any anxiety. It sang the way an old building sings when it's been properly maintained, a stable sound, a sound of continuation. The electrical panel handled the load without drama. The floor was the same floor because some things you kept because some things were what they were, and changing them would change something else that shouldn't be changed. The tool bench was Tommy's arrangement, which Marcus had fully internalized now, and which was, he admitted privately, better than his own had been. The photograph wall was the same wall. 300 plus photographs, names and machines, 38 years of doors opened, and people helped and work done as well as it could be done. And in the left margin of it, where the wall met the space that was just wall, Marcus Holloway's photograph. Gerald's photograph. The mechanic in his garage with his hands at his sides and 38 years of names at his back, looking like a man who was supposed to be there. Beneath it, Marcus had tacked a new notation. Not in handwriting, he typed it on the ancient printer in the back office and cut the paper to size. It said Marcus Holloway, 1985 to present. This wall, every person on it. He'd added the date that morning the way he'd added dates beneath every other photograph. He sat and looked at all of it and thought about the first cohort coming tomorrow morning. 12 people who were going to spend 6 months learning how to listen to broken things and find the reason in this space with his hands to guide them and his knowledge to draw on. And this was the thing he'd been circling around all evening without landing on directly his son's name above the door. They'd installed the sign 2 weeks ago. Simple lettering on a simple board the way Marcus preferred things to James Holloway School of Mechanical Arts. He'd stood in the lot and looked at it when they put it up, and Garrett had been there, and Junior and Sandra Reyes and Riley, and nobody had said anything for a minute, because there was a minute where nothing needed to be said. And then Diana, who had driven from Knoxville with Walt, because Walt had said, "I'm not missing this," had put her hand briefly on Marcus's arm, just a touch there and gone, the specific weight of a person letting you know they understand without making you talk about it. Marcus had looked at his son's name above his garage door for a long time. He'd said, "That's right," not to anyone in particular, just to the fact of it, just to the air and the November cold and the sign and the 15 years that had passed between James and this moment. That's right. He got up from the stool now, the night before the first cohort, and walked to the south wall and stood in front of the photographs. He found James on the wall, not a photograph of a motorcycle, but the one photograph Marcus had added after Gerald's visit, after Claudette's instruction to put the mechanic on the wall after he'd understood that the wall was not just a record of machines, but of the people who mattered to the machines. He'd added James in December, a photograph from 1998 when James was 22 years old, standing in the same garage looking at something off camera with the particular intensity of a young man who is interested in everything. Beneath it in Marcus's handwriting, James Marcus Holloway. He was here. He always will be. Marcus stood in front of his son's photograph and breathed. "Tomorrow," he said aloud quietly to the empty garage. 12 people coming tomorrow. I'm going to teach them what you would have learned." He paused. "What you did learn those years you sat on the milk crate. I'm going to teach it to people who need it the way you needed it, the way I needed it at 16. He put his hand flat on the wall beside the photograph. "You're in the name. You're in the room. You're in every part of this." He stopped. His throat had done what it did when James came close. He let it. "I'm all right," he said. Not to James now, to himself. "I'm all right." He stepped back from the wall. He turned off the overhead light, and the heaters clicked down to maintenance temperature, and the garage settled into its night sounds. And Marcus walked to the bay door and stood in the doorway for a moment, the way he'd stood on the morning the riders left, the way he'd been standing in doorways for 38 years in the threshold between the work and the world. The February night was clear and cold, and the stars were out over Redwood Creek in the way they come out on cold, clear nights, more of them than you expect, the full quantity of the sky making itself known. Marcus stood in his bay door and looked up at them for a minute, which was not something he did frequently, and which he allowed himself now because tomorrow was the kind of tomorrow that warranted a minute of looking at the sky tonight. He locked up. He drove home to Crestview with the window down. Man, they arrived at 8 in the morning. Not all at once, one car, then another. then a truck. Then Deshaun on a bicycle because Deshaun lived 12 miles away and had apparently decided that was rateable, which told Marcus something about him that Marcus filed away as exactly the right kind of information to have about a student. They came in through the bay door and stood in the garage and looked around with the specific look of people who are trying to understand a new space. And Marcus watched them do it from the workbench where he was drinking his coffee. He let them look. He let them look for a full 5 minutes, nobody speaking. 12 of them taking in the tools and the motorcycles and the space heaters and the smell of oil and metal that Marcus had long since stopped smelling because it had become indistinguishable from the air itself. He watched their eyes move to the photograph wall and stay there, most of them reading names in the way Claudette had read names, moving across the accumulated decades of other people's machines and other people's moments of needing help. Then they found his photograph. Several of them, independently at different moments, the recognition that the person in the photograph was the person standing at the workbench because the photograph looked like him, and this was his garage, and the notation below it was his name. Deshaun was the first to look from the photograph to Marcus directly. Marcus met his eyes. "Good morning," Marcus said to all of them. His voice filled the space the way a voice fills a space when it knows where it is. "My name is Marcus Holloway. This is my garage. It's also your school. There's a difference between those two things, and there isn't, and you'll understand what I mean by the end of the week." He set down his coffee. "You're not going to touch a single machine today. You're going to walk through this space, and you're going to use your ears, and you're going to tell me what you hear." He looked from face to face. 12 people, 22 to 51, different backgrounds, different histories, all of them here for the same reason that had brought every person to this garage for 38 years, because they needed something that only this kind of knowledge could give them. "Everything that's broken tells you what it needs," he said. "That's the first thing. The only skill that matters in this building is learning to hear it." He paused. "Are you ready?" 12 people said yes in 12 different ways, all of them meaning it. "Good," Marcus said. "Then let's begin." Sayim. The first cohort graduated in August. The ceremony was in the garage because Marcus had said he wasn't doing anything in a formal hall, and Riley had not argued with him about this. 12 chairs arranged in the bay, 12 families and friends arranged behind them. More people than Marcus had expected. The space was full, in a way it hadn't been full since the night of the storm, warm with body heat and the particular excited quietness of people waiting for something that matters. The photograph wall was visible behind the chairs. All those names, and Marcus had added 12 new photographs to it the week before each cohort member's photograph beside a photograph of the machine that had been their primary project, and beneath each one their name in his handwriting. The date, the notation, they were here, they always will be. Garrett was there, and Junior, and Tommy, and Sandra Reyes, and Patricia O.C. from the community college, and Howard Marsh, and Walt, and Diana, and Claudette, with her notebook because she was writing a follow-up piece, and Gerald Beaumont, who had driven from Memphis and who stood near the back with the photograph of Leonard Shovelhead in his jacket pocket because Marcus knew it was there without being told. Riley sat in the front row beside Walt. When Marcus stood to speak, the garage went quiet. He stood in front of 12 people who had spent 6 months learning to hear what broken things needed, who had rebuilt engines and diagnosed failures and fabricated solutions and made mistakes and found the reason behind the mistakes and tried again, who had sat in the first week with their hands empty and their ears open and learned that patience was a mechanical skill before it was anything else. He looked at them at Deshaun, whose hands now moved with a confidence they hadn't had in February at Clarence, the veteran who had wept in the third week when he finally understood something that 20 years of working alone had prevented him from fully seeing at the 22-year-old named Priya, who had arrived skeptical and uncertain, and who had turned out to have the kind of mechanical intuition that Marcus had only encountered a handful of times in 38 years. At all 12 of them, their faces turned toward him with the particular attention of people who have been trained to pay attention. He hadn't written anything down. He never wrote things down before he spoke. He'd learned in 38 years that what he needed to say was already in him, and that writing it down in advance was a way of trusting himself less than he should. "You came here in February," he said. "You didn't know each other. You didn't know this space. You didn't know me." He paused. "On the first day I told you that everything broken tells you what it needs, and that the only skill that matters is learning to hear it. I want you to know now that I wasn't talking about motorcycles." He let that sit. "I was talking about everything. about people, about places, about the moment in front of you that requires your full attention and your full honesty and the willingness to be wrong until you're right. He looked at Deshaun. Your grandfather knew this, he said. So did yours, Clarence, and yours, Priya. He looked at each of them. The people who taught them knew it. And somewhere before that, someone taught those people going back and back until you reach the beginning of the knowledge, which is just a person who paid enough attention to figure something out and cared enough to give it to the next person. He paused. That's what this is. That's all this has ever been. Attention given, care passed forward. The garage was very quiet. 6 months ago, you walked through that door, Marcus said. Today, you walk out of it with something that belongs to you permanently. Not a certificate, a way of seeing, a way of listening. The thing you learned in the first week when you had empty hands and I asked you to hear the space. He looked at the photograph wall. Your photographs are on that wall. You're in the record now. The record of everyone who has been here and done the work and gone out into the world with this knowledge in their hands. He looked back at the 12 of them. You're going to teach someone else. You don't have to plan it. It will happen because it always happens, because the person who pays attention becomes the person other people bring their broken things to. And some of those people are going to sit where you're sitting and watch the way you watched and carry forward what you give them. He stopped. His voice was doing what it did when James was close. He let it. My son's name is on this building, he said. He never got to sit where you're sitting. But everything he would have learned, everything he would have given forward, it's in this room today. In you. He looked at the wall at James's photograph. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. He looked back at the 12 of them one last time. Go be the person somebody needs. Go open the door. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Deshaun started to applaud and the rest followed, and the garage filled with the sound of it, and Marcus stood in front of the photograph wall with his hands at his sides and received it without deflecting it, because he'd learned was still learning that receiving was also a form of generosity, that letting people give you what they needed to give was its own kind of open door. The riders came back in September, all 17 of them. Marcus heard the engines first the way he'd heard them the first time, that multiple overlapping chord of large displacement motorcycles moving together, and he put down what he was doing and walked to the bay door and stood in the doorway, the same way he'd stood a year ago. Except a year ago he'd been holding an eviction notice, and now he was holding a cup of coffee, and a year ago the sign above the door had been dark, and now it said the James Holloway School of Mechanical Arts. And a year ago he'd had $47 and a Friday deadline, and now he had a program and a fellowship and 12 graduates out in the world with his knowledge in their hands, and a second cohort starting in October. The engines pulled into the lot and cut off one by one 17 riders dismounting in the familiar unhurried way of people who have been moving all day and have arrived where they intended to be. Riley came first, pulled off his helmet, and walked toward Marcus across the gravel with the same deliberate, unhurried stride he'd had in the rain a year ago. And Marcus thought about that walk, the quality of it, the patience in it, the way Riley moved through space like a man who believed that the thing he was going toward would still be there when he arrived. He stopped in front of Marcus. They looked at each other for a moment. You're still here, Riley said. I'm still here, Marcus said. Riley extended his hand. Marcus shook it. And then Riley did something Marcus hadn't expected. He pulled Marcus forward into an embrace brief and firm, the kind that men who don't embrace as a habit produce when the occasion is significant enough to override the habit. Marcus received it. He put one hand on Riley's back for a moment, and then they separated and stood as they had been. Behind Riley, the riders were coming. Walt and Diana Walt steady on his feet and looking better than he had a year ago. Diana with her arms already open, and Marcus accepted her embrace with more ease than he would have managed a year ago, because a year ago he hadn't known what it was like to sit at her table and eat her food and be told plainly that someone intended to keep feeding him. Garrett and Junior and Tommy came through, and Deacon with his shoulder fully healed and his right hand out in greeting, and the riders Marcus had spent one night with, who were now people he knew by name and history, and at the end of the line, Walt, who shook Marcus's hand and held it a beat longer than necessary, and looked at him with the eyes that were still sharp regardless of what the rest of his body was doing on any given day. The school, Walt said, We heard from Sandra Reyes, first cohort. All 12 graduated, Marcus said. All 12 placed. 2 are already talking about starting their own shops. Walt looked at him for a moment. He'd have been proud, he said. Marcus knew who he meant. He always knew who Walt meant when Walt said he. Yes, Marcus said. He would have been. They went inside. Diana went immediately to the camp stove she'd brought again because, of course she had, and the same folding table was out Junior having located it in the storage room with the ease of a man who had put it back there himself, and there was food being assembled with the efficiency of people who had done this before and intended to do it well. The riders spread through the garage in the way that people spread through a space they've been in before recognizing things, noting changes, reading the room with the familiarity of a second visit. Tommy found the new photographs on the wall immediately. He stood in front of them, the first cohort's faces, 12 of them each with their primary project machine, each with their name and date in Marcus's handwriting, and he read them the way he'd read the original wall in the morning after the storm. He stayed there for a long time. Then he turned around. They look like they know something, he said. They do, Marcus said. Tommy nodded. He looked back at the wall. Good, he said. The afternoon went the way the best afternoons go, without a schedule, without a plan. Just people who are glad to be in the same space together, talking and eating and moving through the hours with the ease of a community that has established its footing. Riley and Marcus sat together for a long while near the workbench and talked about the second cohort and the Foundation's plans for a second training site in another state, which Marcus was going to help design in an advisory capacity, and about the exhibition that had opened in April and that had drawn, according to the Foundation's count, more than 4,000 visitors in its first 3 months, many of them stopping specifically in front of the hollow frame engine display, the corrected attribution card, Marcus Holloway, Redwood Creek, Tennessee, 1988 to 1989, catching people in the particular way that accurate things catch people when they've been looking for the true version of something without knowing they were looking. Deacon sat with Marcus for a while, his shoulder working freely now, and told him about a restoration project he was planning and asked 2 specific technical questions that Marcus answered in detail, and Deacon wrote down the answers with the same focused care that Tommy wrote things down, which Marcus noted and appreciated. Walt sat with him last near the end of the afternoon when the food was mostly gone and several of the younger riders had drifted outside into the September evening. How are you sleeping? Walt asked. Better, Marcus said. Diana's food, Walt said. Diana's food helps, Marcus said. Other things too. He looked at the photograph wall, at James's photograph, at the first cohort's photographs, at all of it. I think the school helps. Having somewhere for all of it to go. He paused. For 38 years, the knowledge was in here. He tapped his chest, and it stayed here because there wasn't a clear enough door to give it through. Now there's a door. Walt looked at him. That's what you've always built, he said. Doors. I didn't know that's what they were, Marcus said. The best things usually aren't, Walt said. You just open them. The door figures out what it is by what comes through it. The afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in Tennessee in September, going gold and long, coming through the bay door at an angle that made the garage look like something worth painting, which Marcus would never have thought about in those terms, but which he registered as the particular beauty of a place that is working correctly, that is being used for what it is for, that is full of what it should be full of. He sat in it and felt it and didn't turn away from the feeling, because he had learned in the past year, was still learning, would be learning until he didn't have any more time to learn that the right response to a moment that matters is not to guard against it, but to let it be as large as it actually is. Riley came to stand beside him when the sun had gone lower and the riders were beginning to move toward their bikes. Same time next year, Riley said. Same time next year, Marcus said. He stood in the bay door and watched them go. One by one, the engines started the familiar overlapping chord, assembling itself from individual notes, and then the formation moved and found the road and accelerated away toward the highway, growing smaller and quieter, and then gone. The sound lasted a little longer than the sight of them, and then that was gone too, and Redwood Creek was quiet, and Marcus Holloway stood in the doorway of the school that carried his son's name in the garage, that had been his entire adult life, in the place where 17 strangers had come through a rainstorm, and where everything that followed had followed because he had opened the door. He looked up at the sign. He looked at the photograph wall visible through the open bay. All those names, all those years, and his own face among them now, and James's face beside his, and 12 new faces from the cohort that had just begun to carry the knowledge forward, and 12 more coming in October. And after that, more still, the knowledge moving outward from this building. The way sound moves from its source, reaching distances it was never intended to reach. Finding people who didn't know they were waiting for it. He put his hand on the door frame. The wood was solid under his hand, repaired, reinforced, built to hold. Some doors Marcus Holloway had learned stay open because someone built them right. And some stay open because the man who stands in them never once in 38 years chose to close them. And the world, which had been watching longer than he knew, had finally come home to say so.